Emily Dawson drove the axe into the frozen ground so hard the handle cracked. Her hands were bleeding. Her back had stopped hurting 2 hours ago because it had gone completely numb. The temperature was dropping fast, and she had 16 more logs to move before dark. She didn't stop. She didn't cry. She just pulled the axe free, gripped the splintered handle tighter, and swung again. Because if she stopped even for one breath, the town of Millhaven would win, and Emily Dawson had already lost everything else. She was not going to lose this too. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The axe came down again, and again, and again. Emily didn't count the swings anymore. Counting made her think about how many were left, and thinking about how many were left made her want to sit down, and sitting down in this cold meant she might not get back up. So she stopped counting. She just swung. She just breathed. She just kept moving. The log split clean down the middle, and she dragged both halves to the edge of the site, what she still called the site in her head, because calling it the cabin felt like a dare. She wasn't sure she could back up yet. The ground was iron hard. Montana in November had no mercy, and it had even less for a woman working alone. She'd been out here since before sunrise. She'd go until she lost the light. That was the deal she made with herself every single morning. Not with God, not with fate, with herself. Because those were the only terms she trusted anymore. The town of Millhaven sat 3 miles east, and even from here she could feel it watching her. Not with concern, with amusement, with the low, ugly satisfaction of people who had already decided how her story ended and were waiting almost eagerly for the part where they got to be right. She heard it every time she went to the general store for supplies. There goes the widow Dawson. You see how much rope she bought. What's she building out there, a coffin? She'll freeze to death before Christmas, mark my words. Shame, really. Well, not much of a shame. She heard it. She always heard it. She had learned in the 8 months since James died that people rarely bothered to lower their voices when they were talking about someone they didn't respect. Cruelty liked an audience. Emily set her jaw and reached for the next log. James Dawson had been a good man. Not a perfect one. No man was, but a good one, and he'd loved her in the uncomplicated, steady way that some men manage and most don't. He'd never once made her feel like her body was something to apologize for. He'd never flinched. He'd never looked away. In a world that seemed to have a great deal of opinions about the amount of space Emily took up, James had simply been glad she was there to take it up. Then the mine shaft collapsed. 3 men went down. None came back up. They gave the widows each a handshake and a letter that said the company regretted the loss and accepted no liability. Emily's neighbor Margaret got the same letter. So did a woman named Clara, who lived on the other side of town with 4 children and nowhere to go. After the funeral, Emily discovered that James had borrowed against nearly everything they had to keep the house going through the previous winter. The house went to the bank 6 weeks after they put him in the ground. She moved into a boarding room above the saloon because it was the only thing she could afford, and the landlady, a thin-mouthed woman named Mrs. Alcott, made it clear that she considered Emily's presence a temporary inconvenience she was being generously compensated to endure. A woman your size ought to take up less space than she does, Mrs. Alcott said once, not quite under her breath, while Emily was carrying a bucket of water up the stairs. Emily had kept walking. She kept walking a lot in those days. But she had not walked without a destination. That was the difference. Because even in those first weeks of fog and grief and borrowed rooms, Emily had been thinking, planning, doing arithmetic in her head while she tried to sleep, calculating what she had left, what she could save, what was possible. And what was possible, barely. Barely possible was a quarter section of land 2 miles west of Millhaven that nobody wanted. The ground was rocky. The location was exposed. A previous claim had been abandoned after one winter, and the county had taken it back. Emily had enough left from James's small life insurance payment after the deaths and the burial, and Mrs. Alcott's first month to buy it outright. Just the land. Not a house. Not materials. Not supplies. just the land. She'd stood in the county office and signed the paper with her hand shaking and her chin perfectly steady. And then she'd walked back out into the cold November air and stood on the street and thought, well, now what? Now she built. She learned by doing, which was the hard way, which was the only way available to her. She borrowed every book she could find about construction. There weren't many, and most of them assumed the reader had help. She watched the men building the new livery stable on the edge of town, studied how they did it, how they moved the heavy pieces, how they set the foundation logs, how they stacked and notched. She asked questions when she could find someone willing to answer them without laughing. Mostly, she just figured it out. Her hands had blistered and then bled and then calloused over until they felt like someone else's hands, rougher, harder, more capable than the hands she'd had before. Her shoulders ached every night with a deep, bone-level exhaustion that she'd come to think of as honest. She fell asleep within minutes of lying down and woke before dawn without needing an alarm, because her body simply knew the work was waiting. She didn't love it. She didn't hate it. It was what was required, so she did it. That was how Emily Dawson had always moved through the world, actually. Not with drama, not with speeches, just with the quiet, relentless determination to do what was required because someone had to and no one else was going to. She set the log in place and straightened up, pressing her fist against the small of her back. The sky was the color of old pewter, flat and heavy, the kind of sky that usually meant snow before nightfall. She had maybe 3 hours of good light left. 2 courses of logs on the east wall if she pushed. 1.5 if she was honest about her energy level. She looked at the wall. She pushed. She didn't notice the man on the ridge right away. She almost never noticed him right away. He was still and quiet and far enough up the hillside that he was easy to miss if you weren't looking. But eventually, usually in the middle of the afternoon, when the light shifted, her eyes would catch the dark shape of a horse and rider against the gray sky, and she'd know he was there again. The lonely cowboy on the ridge. She'd asked about him in town once early on. The response she'd gotten was the kind of response that told her more about Millhaven than it did about the man. "Oh, that's just William Carter," said old Pete at the general store, not looking up from his ledger. "Rancher, keeps to himself. Lost his wife a couple years back, him and the baby both. Tragedy, I suppose. But he was odd before that, too. Don't pay him any mind." Don't pay him any mind. She'd nodded and bought her nails and gone back to work. But she paid him mind. Not because she was interested in him. She wasn't interested in anyone, couldn't afford to be, didn't have the energy or the room in her head for it, but because she was a woman working alone on an exposed piece of land, and a man who watched you every afternoon was either a threat or a mystery, and she needed to know which. She'd looked up one day and stared directly at him. Long enough to make the point. He hadn't moved, hadn't turned away, just sat his horse and looked back at her from a quarter-mile up the hill, completely unashamed, and somehow she couldn't explain this completely unthreatening. Like a man who wasn't watched the way most men watched women, but watching her the way someone watches something they find quietly astonishing. It had unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite name. She'd gone back to work. That had been 6 weeks ago. He was still up there. She was 3 courses up on the east wall and starting on the south when the temperature dropped sharply enough that she felt it through her coat. She stopped, looked at the sky, and felt the particular stillness in the air that meant bad weather was close. Not in 3 hours, maybe in 1. She made a decision fast, the way you had to make decisions when you were alone, and the margin for error was thin. She wasn't going to be able to get home. Home was Mrs. Alcott's boarding house, and it was 3 miles in the direction the weather was coming from. By the time she got there, she'd be soaked through, and Mrs. Alcott didn't keep the common room heated after 8 o'clock, and Emily had been sick once already this season and couldn't afford to be sick again. She started covering what she could. There was a small lean-to she'd built in the first week out of scraps and stubbornness, barely big enough to sleep in with a tin roof she'd salvaged from the previous claim's debris. It wasn't warm, it wasn't comfortable, but it was shelter, and she had a wool blanket and a half-eaten tin of hardtack and a small spirit lamp, and she would survive the night. She'd survived worse. She was pulling the canvas tarp over the stack of lumber, her most precious resource. The wood she'd spent 2 months accumulating, the wood that stood between her and a cabin she could actually live in when she heard the horse. She straightened up fast hand, going to her coat pocket, where she kept the small revolver James had left her. She turned. The man from the ridge was coming down the hill. He was on a dark bay horse, broad-shouldered and steady, and he was leading a second horse behind him, a pack animal loaded with something she couldn't make out yet. He moved unhurriedly, but with the kind of directness that told her this wasn't a casual approach. He'd made a decision up on that ridge, and he was following through on it. Emily pulled the revolver out of her pocket and held it at her side. Not raised, not aimed, just visible. She was not a woman who pointed guns at people she hadn't yet identified as a threat. But she was not a woman who put guns away when a stranger came toward her alone in bad weather either. He stopped his horse about 20 feet out. Even in the gray light she could see him early 40s, she'd guess, with the weathered face of a man who'd spent most of his life outside. He had the look of someone who'd once carried a great deal of ease in his body and no longer knew quite where he'd put it. His eyes went to the gun at her side, then to her face, then to the tarp she'd been securing, then back to her face. He reached up and touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, you've been watching me for 6 weeks," she said. Not an accusation, just a fact. She wanted him to know she knew. Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, more like acknowledgement. "Yes, ma'am, I have." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man searching for a lie, but the quiet of a man who was making sure the truth he had was the right one to say. "Because I couldn't figure out how you were doing it," he said finally. "So I kept watching." Emily looked at him steadily. The first snow was starting, just a few flakes thin and exploratory, the scouts before the army. "What are you doing here now?" "Storm's coming fast," he said. "Bad one. I've got a read on the weather in these mountains, and this one's going to be worse than the last 3 combined." He tilted his head toward the pack horse. "Brought some supplies. Timber supports, heavy canvas rope, some food that doesn't need cooking. Figured you'd need it. I didn't ask you for anything." "No, ma'am, you didn't." The snow was coming harder now. She could feel the wind picking up at her back, pushing in from the north with that particular mean-spirited energy that Montana storms specialized in. She looked at the pack horse. She looked at the man. "Why?" she said again. "And I want a real answer this time." He looked at her with eyes that were gray or blue. She couldn't tell in this light, and they were tired eyes, she thought. Not from the day's work. From something longer and heavier than that. "I've been living up there," he said, nodding toward the ridge, "for 2 years. And in 2 years, I haven't done one useful thing for another person. I watched you working out here every day for 6 weeks, and I thought, I don't know. I thought that was a waste." "A waste of what?" "Of whatever it is I still have left to give," he said simply. Emily studied him for another 5 seconds. The wind gusted hard, and she felt the tarp pull against her grip. The pack horse shifted and stamped. She put the revolver back in her pocket. "The lumber needs covering first," she said. "North side is the most exposed. Those long supports go here." She pointed. "Can you tie a proper knot?" For the first time, something that might have been a smile moved at the corner of his mouth, though it didn't quite arrive. "Yes, ma'am, I can tie a proper knot." "Then get down and help me." His name was William Carter, and he did not explain himself further, and Emily did not ask. They worked in near silence through the first hour of the storm, moving fast and coordinated in a way that surprised her. He understood without being told how to anticipate what she needed, how to hold a load so she could secure it, how to read her movements and get out of the way, or fill a gap at exactly the right moment. She'd worked with men before who couldn't manage that, who required direction for every step, who made her feel like she was managing 2 jobs at once. This one just worked. She noted it, filed it, said nothing. By the time the storm hit properly, the full force of it, the kind of snow that came sideways and hit your face like thrown sand. They had the lumber secure, the lean-to reinforced with the timber supports he'd brought, and a second layer of canvas over the whole structure. Emily's fingers were past pain and into that dangerous territory where they felt warm, which meant they were freezing, and she was making herself flex them regularly just to keep the blood moving. They crawled into the lean-to. It was barely big enough for two, and it occurred to Emily that 8 months ago she'd have found the situation impossible. A widow and a strange man crammed into a shelter the size of a large closet, waiting out a blizzard. She found to her own mild surprise that she didn't care. She was too cold, too tired, and too practical for scandal. She lit the spirit lamp. The small warmth of it felt enormous. William Carter sat with his back against the far wall, knees pulled up, hat in his hands, looking at the flame. His face in the lamplight was different than it had been in the gray afternoon, less guarded, she thought, or maybe just less capable of maintaining the guard. He looked like a man who spent a great deal of effort not feeling things and was currently too tired to keep it up. She handed him a piece of hardtack. He took it with a brief nod. They sat in silence for a while. The wind screamed outside. The canvas walls of the lean-to pushed and pulled like something breathing. "Your wife," Emily said eventually. Not a question, just an opening if he wanted it. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to take it. Then he said, "Eleanor. And the baby, we would have named him after my father. He didn't make it either. Fever the winter of '85. "I'm sorry. Your husband," he said the same way she'd said it. "James, the Harlan Creek mine, March of this year." He nodded once, slow. "You don't say you're sorry," she observed. "Didn't figure you wanted it," he said. "You don't seem like a woman who wants people sorry." She thought about that. "What do I seem like?" He looked at her directly, which most people didn't do. Most people looked slightly past her, or slightly at the ground, or at some point in the middle distance that let them pretend they were paying attention without actually having to see her. William Carter looked at her the way you looked at a problem you were genuinely trying to understand. "Honest," he said. "Capable. Angry, but not in a way that makes you stupid. And stubborn in a way that is probably going to get you through this winter, even if it kills you." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "That might be the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in years." "I'm generally better at observing than talking," he said. "I noticed." The lamp threw shadows across the canvas walls. Outside, the storm had settled into its full serious work, the kind of winter storm that took Montana personally. Emily could feel the temperature dropping even in the lean-to, but the canvas was holding, and the timber supports were solid, and they were both dry, which was more than she'd expected an hour ago. "You're going to help me finish it," she said. Not a question. He looked up. "Ma'am, the cabin. You came with supplies, and you know things I don't know yet, and I can see you don't have anything better to do." She met his eyes evenly. "I'm not asking you to do it for me. I'm asking you to work alongside me. I'll pay you what I can when I can, which isn't much, but—" "I don't need pay," he said. "I won't take charity." "It's not charity." He paused. "It's neighboring." Emily considered the word. It had a simple dignity to it that she hadn't heard in a long time. "All right," she said. "Neighboring." He nodded, pulled his hat back on, looked at the canvas wall like he was seeing through it to the mountains beyond. She thought, not for the first time, and not for the last, that this was a man who had been very, very far away from himself for a very long time, and who was only just beginning in some cautious and tentative way to find his way back. She didn't say so. She reached over and turned the spirit lamp down to save the oil, and they sat in the dark together while the storm said its worst to the Montana mountains, and the lean-to held, and the lumber held. And somehow, against considerable odds, they both held too. In the morning, the storm had broken. The world was white and absolutely silent in the particular way it gets after a heavy snow. Not peaceful exactly, but emptied out, like everything that was going to happen next hadn't decided yet. Emily was up before light, checking the lumber, assessing what the storm had done. William was already outside when she emerged, had already cleared the snow off the canvas tarp, was already on his knees in the frozen ground, checking the base logs she'd set in the first course. She stopped and watched him. He ran, his hands along the wood. The way a doctor checks a wound, thorough, unhurried, looking for something that might not be visible from the surface. He found a split in one of the foundation logs. She'd been worried about that one, and sat back on his heels and studied it with an expression of concentration so complete it almost looked like grief. "This one needs to come out," he said without looking up. "It'll fail under load." "I know," she said. "I've been putting it off because I'd have to recut. Better to do it right." "I know that too." He looked up at her then, and something passed between them that wasn't quite understanding. Yet it was earlier than that, was more like the first reaching gesture of it. He stood up, brushing snow off his knees. "You got another log that'll work?" "Two possibilities. I've been putting them aside." "Show me." She showed him. They spent the morning cutting and dressing the replacement log, which took longer than it should have because the ground was frozen solid and every tool movement required twice the effort. He worked without complaint. So did she. They didn't talk much. When they did, it was precise, about angles, about weights, about where to set the notch. She noticed that he was careful with her. Not in the way men were sometimes careful with women, the way that looked like care but felt like condescension, managing them, protecting them from the truth of things. He was careful with her, the way you were careful with someone you respected. He explained things when he knew something she didn't, briefly and without performance, and then he moved on. He didn't repeat himself. He didn't soften information. He just told her what was true. She found to her own surprise that it had been a while since someone had done that. By midday, they'd set the new foundation log and started on the next course. He showed her a notching technique she hadn't learned yet, a tighter fit that would reduce the gaps the wind could find. She copied his movements, got it wrong twice, got it right the third time, and did not thank him for his patience because he hadn't made her feel like she needed to. She was slowly realizing something. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Emily would later struggle to explain, not because it was complicated, but because it was so simple, and simplicity was hard to put into words. He came in the mornings. They worked. They broke at noon for whatever she'd packed, which was usually bread and dried meat, and sometimes an apple if she'd planned well. They worked until dark. He rode back to his ranch. He didn't push conversation. She didn't fill silences to be polite. They worked. But things were said in pieces in the gaps between lifting and setting and checking. Small things at first. Practical things. Then gradually, less practical things. She told him about James, not the death, but the life. The way James whistled while he worked. The fact that he'd been a terrible cook but had insisted on cooking every Sunday because he thought it was important. The mining job he'd taken because the mill closed and there were no other options. And what do you do when there are no other options? He listened, the way people almost never listened, without preparing his response, without waiting for his turn, just actually hearing what she said. "He sounds like a man who was trying," William said once. "He was always trying," she said. "That's the hardest thing to miss. Not the person exactly, but the trying." He was quiet after that, in a way that felt like recognition. He told her about Eleanor in pieces 2 over days. She'd been a school teacher. She'd laughed too loudly for indoor spaces and hadn't cared. She'd argued with the minister about scripture every Sunday and then shaken his hand on the way out. The baby had come early, and Eleanor had fought for 3 days, and William had sat by the bed and talked to her continuously, because the doctor said hearing was the last thing to go, and he wanted the last thing she heard to be him telling her she was the bravest person he'd ever known. Emily didn't say she was sorry. He'd been right about that. It wasn't what she would have wanted. She said, "She sounds like someone who made a lot of noise in a good way." He almost smiled. She absolutely did. The town noticed. Of course, the town noticed. Millhaven was small enough that a woman working alone on a hill had been noticed, and a man helping her work was a story, and stories were currency, and some people in that town were very wealthy with them. Emily went to the general store for nails. One morning she went every week or so for something and found the quality of the silence had changed. It was a different kind of quiet than it used to be. Before they'd ignored her loudly, the way you ignore something you don't want to encourage. Now they were ignoring her with attention, watching without looking, listening without appearing to. She set her money on the counter and said, £3 of 6-penny nails, please, and old Pete got them without comment, but the two women by the dry goods shelf exchanged a look that said everything. She took her nails and left. That afternoon, a woman named Helen Marsh stopped her on the road. Helen was maybe 60, the wife of one of the town council members, and she had the kind of face that had once been handsome, and had settled into the permanent expression of someone who'd spent a lifetime making judgments and rarely revising them. "Mrs. Dawson," Helen said, blocking her path with the gentle implacability of someone used to being in charge of things. "I thought I should say something as a neighbor." "Ma'am," Emily said. "People are talking," Helen said, "about you and William Carter. It's not appropriate a woman of your situation spending so much time with an unmarried man. People are drawing conclusions." "People can draw whatever conclusions they like," Emily said. "He's helping me build a house." "I understand that, but appearances—" "Mrs. Marsh," Emily said, and her voice was even, and she kept her eyes on the older woman's face. "I have been a widow for 8 months. In those 8 months, I have purchased land. I have hauled lumber. I have learned to notch and set foundation logs. I have slept in a lean-to through 2 blizzards, and I have not asked anyone in this town for a single thing. I don't mean to be rude to you, but I don't have much attention left over for appearances." Helen Marsh blinked. It was possible Emily thought that no one had talked to her quite like that in some time. "Well," Helen said finally, "I just thought you should know." "Thank you," Emily said. "I appreciate you thinking of me." She walked on. She told William about it that afternoon casually while they were working. Not because she wanted his opinion. Because it had happened, and it was part of the texture of the day. He set down his mallet. "What did she say exactly?" Emily repeated it. He picked the mallet back up and drove a peg into the wood with a precision that suggested controlled feeling. "People in this town," he said, "have a great deal of energy for other people's business." "They always have," Emily said. "I just used to be someone they talked about rather than talked to." He looked at her. "What changed?" She thought about it. "I stopped caring what they thought," she said. "And somehow that made them need me to care more." Howe was quiet for a moment. "That's worth remembering," he said. "About people." She nodded. They went back to work. The walls were 3/4 up. The cabin was beginning to look like a cabin, on a clear, cold afternoon, with the sky hard and blue as glass. Emily stood back from the south hall and looked at what they'd built. It was a modest thing. 1 room and a loft, a stone fireplace, rough-laid on one side. Windows she'd cut herself with a handsaw, but it was solid, and it was square, and it was hers. She stood looking at it for a long time. William stood beside her. Not touching, just there. "You're going to make it," he said. It wasn't encouragement exactly. It was more like a statement of observed fact. "You were going to make it before I got here too. I just moved the timeline." "You moved it considerably," she said. "Maybe." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the cabin with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something careful and quiet in it. Something that had been put there recently, like new furniture in an old room that hadn't quite settled into place yet. "William," she said. "Ma'am. Why did you really come down off that ridge?" He was slow to answer. The wind moved through the pines above them. A hawk called somewhere distant. "Because I'd been watching you work every day for 6 weeks, he said, "and every day I thought somebody should help that woman. And every day I talked myself out of it. And the night of that first storm I finally got tired of myself." Emily considered this. "That's honest." "I try to be." She looked back at the cabin. "You know the thing about this place," she said quietly. "It's not just a house, it's proof." She paused. "Proof that I existed. That I tried. That I didn't let them tell me what I was worth." He heard that. She could tell by the way he went still. "Nobody's going to take that from you," he said. And something in his voice when he said it wasn't quite a promise. It was heavier than that, more certain. The way the foundation logs were certain, not promising to hold, but simply holding. She nodded once. They went back to work. The sun dropped behind the mountains, and the cold came down hard and fast, the way it did in November, when the sun left, and Emily pulled her coat tighter and kept setting the last logs of the day, while William held the opposite end and called the angle. And somewhere in the middle of all of that ordinary and difficult work, a thing shifted subtle as a key turning in a lock, so old you'd forgotten the door could open. Neither of them named it. They had Emily thought enough sense not to name things before they were ready. But it was there, and it was the start of something that neither grief nor cold, nor all the small cruelties of Millhaven, Montana, had quite managed to kill. The days after the storm had a different weight to them. Not lighter. Nothing about Montana in December was light but different. Changed in some way that Emily couldn't measure with any tool she owned, only feel in the way you feel a shift in weather before it arrives. The work was the same. The cold was the same. The town of Millhaven sat 3 miles east and went on being exactly what it had always been. But something in the texture of the days had altered, and she moved through that alteration carefully. The way you move through a room, you know well that someone has rearranged in the dark. William came every morning. He didn't announce it. He didn't ask permission. He simply appeared at the edge of the site when the sky was still more dark than light, his horse steady and his breath misting in the cold. And he worked until the light failed, and then he rode back to his ranch on the ridge. She'd stopped waiting for the day he wouldn't show up. That probably meant something. She wasn't ready to think about what. The cabin was coming together in ways she hadn't let herself imagine when she'd first stood on the frozen ground and tried to picture it whole. The walls were up. The roof beams were set. William had shown her a technique for the rafters, a particular angle and spacing that would shed snow load better than the standard pitch, and she'd spent a full day on that alone, getting it right, refusing to move on until it was right while he worked below on the window frames without saying a word about how long she was taking. She'd come down at the end of that day with her arms burning and her hands locked half open, and he'd looked up from his work and said, "Good angle." 2 words. She'd felt better about those 2 words than she'd felt about most speeches. But the town was louder now. That was the thing she hadn't accounted for. How the cabin getting closer to finished seemed to make Millhaven's discomfort more acute rather than less. As if each log placed was a small provocation, as if the building itself was an argument the town couldn't find a clean way to refute. It was on a Thursday, 12 days after the storm, that the first real trouble announced itself. Emily had gone to town for lamp oil and flour, a quick trip she'd been putting off, and she was in the general store when she heard the voice of Thomas Reed. She'd seen Thomas Reed before, in the way you see someone you've been warned about with your peripheral vision, with a little extra attention that you try to make look like no attention at all. He was a big man, prosperous in the particular loud way that men who'd made money quickly sometimes were, with a new coat and old manners and the settled confidence of someone who'd never had to question whether he belonged somewhere. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county. He sat on the town council. He had a voice that carried, and he didn't seem to mind that it did. She heard her name in it. Widow Dawson, yes, that's the one, building that cabin on the Harrow land. A pause. A chuckle that wasn't friendly. I'll give her credit for gumption, but gumption doesn't make a legal claim. I've had my lawyer looking at the county records, and there are questions about that title. Real questions. Emily stood very still on her side of a shelf of dry goods. What kind of questions? Said a second voice she didn't recognize. The kind that might require the county to revisit the sale, Thomas said. Land like that, properly managed, could support 30 head easy. Right now, it's supporting a half-built shack and a widow who clearly doesn't know what she's doing. She set her lamp oil on the counter. I'll take that flour too, she said to Pete, who was looking at his hands. Yes, ma'am, Pete said without looking up. She could feel Thomas Reed's attention shift to her. She felt it the way you feel heat from a fire, directional, sourceable, impossible to ignore. She kept her eyes on Pete. Mrs. Dawson, Thomas said, and his voice had changed friendlier now, the way voices went friendly right before they tried to sell you something. I wasn't aware you were in here. Clearly, she said. I wonder if I might have a word. I'm in the middle of a purchase, Mr. Reed. Of course, of course. He waited while Pete measured the flour. She could feel him waiting, patient in the way that powerful men were patient, knowing the conversation would happen on his schedule eventually, because conversations always did. She paid. She picked up her goods. She looked at Thomas Reed for the first time directly, and he was exactly what she'd expected, and nothing she was afraid of, and she made sure he could see both of those things in her face. I know what you're doing, she said quietly enough that it stayed between them. And you should know that I have read every document associated with that land purchase 3 times. Every one. I know what I own." His expression shifted just slightly, just at the edges, in a way that told her she'd surprised him. Men like Thomas Reed were surprised when women read documents. She filed that away. "I'm sure you do," he said smoothly. "I'm simply suggesting that sometimes these things are more complicated than they appear." "Then I suppose I'll meet the complication when it arrives," she said. "Good day, Mr. Reed." She walked out. She made it 40 yards down the street before her hands started shaking, and she stopped and held the bag of flour against her chest and breathed once, twice, 3 times until the shaking stopped. Not from fear exactly. From the effort of being calm when she hadn't felt calm. From the specific exhaustion of having to be twice as steady as you actually were, because steadiness was the only currency you had left. She told William that afternoon. She told him the way she'd told him about Helen Marsh plainly, while they worked as if it were just information. She was getting good at that. Turning fear into information. Handing it over and letting someone else hold some of the weight for a moment. He listened without stopping work. His mallet kept moving, but his jaw was tighter than usual and his next swing was harder than it needed to be. "Thomas Reed," he said. "You know him. I know of him. He's been after 3 or 4 parcels in this county over the past 5 years. Usually finds a way to get them." He paused. "Usually goes after people who don't have resources to push back." "I don't have resources," Emily said. "You have me," he said, and then seemed to hear how that sounded and looked away. "I mean, I know people. I can find out what he's actually got on that title claim." "I'd appreciate that," she said. Said matter of fact, the same way she said everything, but she kept the other thing. He'd said somewhere in the back of her mind, turned it over once or twice like a stone you pick up because the shape of it is interesting, and then set it carefully aside. "You have me." 3 days later, William came to the site with a name and a fact. The name was Daniel Holt, a county clerk who owed William a favor from 7 years back. The fact was that Thomas Reed had approached the county assessor's office twice in the past 6 weeks, requesting review of the Harrow land title, and had been told twice that the sale was clean and the record was clear. "He's looking for something that isn't there," William said. "But that doesn't mean he'll stop looking. What does he actually want?" "The land." William set down the board he'd been carrying. "He's had his eye on that whole ridge since before you bought it. Water access. He runs cattle and the creek that runs through your property is year-round. That's valuable." Emily looked at him. "How long have you known this?" "The creek part I knew that before. The rest I found out 3 days ago." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" He met her eyes without flinching. "Because I was figuring out whether there was a real threat or just noise, and I didn't want to worry you over noise." "I don't need protecting from information," she said. "No," he said. "You don't. I'm sorry." The apology was so direct and so unqualified that she was momentarily without a response. Most apologies were architecture. They were built to look like accountability while being mostly about the person giving them. This was just an apology. 2 clean words. "All right," she said. "Tell me everything you know," he told her. She listened the way she listened to everything completely without interrupting, filing things in their proper places. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He's going to try something more direct next. The official channels aren't giving him what he wants." "Probably," William said. "Do you know who he uses when he wants something done directly?" He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I want to know where the problem is before it reaches me," she said. "Not after." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite admiration, not quite surprise. More like the recognition of a quality you'd been told to expect, but hadn't quite believed until you saw it. "I'll find out," he said. The night it happened was clear and cold and moonless. Emily didn't sleep at the lean-to every night. Some nights she made the walk back to Mrs. Alcott's because she needed a full night in a real bed and couldn't afford to lose the productivity. The cold cost her when she didn't sleep properly. But this particular night, she'd stayed late working by lantern light on the fireplace hearth, fitting the stones, and by the time she'd stopped, it was too dark and too cold to walk back. So she wrapped herself in her blankets and lay down and was asleep almost immediately. She woke to the sound of something wrong. She couldn't have said what exactly. Not a voice, not a crash. Just the particular quality of wrong that woke you like cold water, even when you couldn't name the source of it. She was upright before she was fully conscious, hand on the revolver, ears working. Silence. Then movement. Outside the lean-to. Heavy and deliberate moving toward the lumber stack. She was out of the lean-to in seconds, revolver up. 2 men. She could see their shapes in the starlight, both large, both moving, with the particular unhurried confidence of men who didn't expect to be caught. One of them was reaching for the tarp over her lumber. "Step away from that," she said. They stopped. One of them turned slowly. He had the kind of face that hadn't thought much of her before she spoke, and wasn't revising his opinion now. "Lady," he said, "you don't want to point that at me." "I'm pointing it at you," she said. "Step away from the lumber." "We're just having a look," the second one said. "No harm in looking." "It's 2 in the morning," Emily said. "Step away from my lumber, or I'll put a hole in something you'd rather keep." The first man laughed a short, contemptuous sound and took a step toward her. She fired. Not at him. Past him close enough that he'd feel the heat of it. He stopped. The sound of the shot split the night open and then fell away into the trees and left a silence that was a completely different quality than the one before. "That was the warning," Emily said. Her voice was steady, completely steady. "The next one won't be." They went. She heard their horses tied somewhere in the dark, and then the sound of them moving off fast, and then nothing. She stood in the cold for a long time, after not from fear, but because her legs were a little less reliable than usual, and she was giving them a moment to remember what they were for. Then she checked the lumber, untouched all of it, and went back inside and sat down and looked at her hands. They were shaking now. That was fine. They were allowed to shake now. She was at the site before sunrise, checking everything again in daylight, making an inventory of what she had and what was missing. Nothing. Nothing was missing, and she was on her 3rd cup of coffee from the small pot she'd started learning to make over the spirit lamp when William rode down. He read her face immediately. She'd noticed he did that not in a searching or invasive way, but simply accurately the way people who had suffered read other people who had suffered. "What happened?" he said. Not a question, a statement waiting to be filled. She told him. He listened without moving. When she finished, his expression was very still and very controlled, which she'd learned meant the opposite of what stillness usually meant. "You're not hurt," he said. "No." "The lumber's untouched." "Yes." He dismounted. He walked to the lumber stack and looked at it for a moment, his back to her. Then he turned around. "I'm going to find out who those men were," he said. "I already have a fair idea. Thomas Reed." "Most likely." He paused. "Emily." It was the first time he'd used her name. Not ma'am. Not Mrs. Dawson. Her name. She looked at him. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," he said. "He's done this before, started with legal pressure, moved to direct intimidation when the legal angle didn't hold. If those men didn't get what they came for, he'll try something else, something harder." "I know," she said. "I want to." He stopped, started again. "I think someone should stay here, at night, to watch the property." "You're offering to sleep on the ground in December," she said. "I've slept in worse." "William." She looked at him steadily. "I fired a warning shot at 2 men this morning before sunrise. I think we've established I can manage a night." "You shouldn't have to." "A lot of things shouldn't be the way they are," she said. "That's not an argument against managing them." He looked at her for a moment, with that expression she'd started to recognize, the one that wasn't quite admiration, and wasn't quite something else, but lived somewhere between them in territory she didn't have a name for yet. "You're the most stubborn person I've ever met," he said. "Coming from you, I'll take that as high praise." Something that was almost a smile moved across his face, and then thought better of it. "Let me at least get you a better lock for the lean-to. That I'll accept." He got her a better lock. He also, over the next several days, quietly reinforced the lumber stack with a system of trip lines and warning bells that would sound if anyone approached at night, his design built and installed without comment, as if it were simply a practical thing that needed doing. She watched him put it together and didn't say anything except to ask one or two questions about the mechanics, which he answered. They were getting good at this, the management of things that didn't have words, the things that sat alongside the work and didn't need naming to be real. The next trouble came from a direction she hadn't expected. It was Samuel Briggs, the county recorder, a small man with anxious eyes and a mustache that was trying harder than he was, who appeared at the site one afternoon with a piece of paper he held in both hands as if it might escape. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, and he was already apologetic before he'd said another word. "I've been instructed, that is, there's been a formal request filed for review of the completion status of your claim." Emily set down the board she was holding. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning that under county code, a land claim established for residential purpose must show substantial completion of a residential structure within the period specified in the original claim documents." He swallowed. "Mr. Reed has filed a formal inquiry suggesting that your structure may not meet the definition of substantial completion, and that the county should determine whether the original terms of the claim are being satisfied." Emily looked at him. She kept her voice even. "And what is the timeline on this inquiry?" 2 weeks, Briggs said. He looked genuinely pained. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Dawson. I want you to know, I can see clearly that—" He gestured helplessly at the walls around them. 2 weeks to what? William said. He'd been up in the rafters and had come down without her noticing. 2 weeks for what determination? Briggs, startled at William's presence, clearly hadn't seen him. 2 weeks for the county to determine whether the structure meets residential completion requirements. If it doesn't. If it doesn't what? Emily said. The claim reverts, Briggs said, very quietly, to county possession, and then goes to open sale. The silence after that was its own kind of weather. Emily didn't look at William. She didn't look at anything except Briggs and the paper in his hands. What constitutes substantial completion under county code? Briggs blinked. He hadn't expected the question. Well, a roof, 4 walls, a functional hearth, basic habitability. I have 3 of those 4, Emily said. The hearth will be done in a week. Then I would suggest, Briggs said, and he said it with the careful precision of a man who was going slightly further than his job description required, that you finish the hearth. He handed her the paper and left with the speed of a man who was uncomfortable with what he'd been asked to do. Emily held the paper and looked at it for a long moment. 2 weeks, William said. I heard him. The hearth is a week's work if we push, she said. Maybe less. It's stonework. It has to cure before you can use it. I know that. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Can we do it in time? He was quiet for exactly 1 second. Yes, he said. 1 word. The same certainty as the foundation logs. Not promising, just holding. They pushed. It was the hardest 10 days Emily had spent since the weeks after James died, and those weeks had been very hard indeed. They worked from before sunrise to well past dark. And some days the cold was bad enough that she had to stop every 20 minutes and warm her hands over the fire, or risk losing sensation in her fingers, and losing sensation in your fingers. When you were doing stonework was how you lost fingers. William seemed to be made of something different than ordinary men. He didn't appear to get cold the way she did, or if he did, he dealt with it internally with the same economy he applied to everything. She asked him once how he managed it. Practice, he said, and I feel it. I just already decided it wasn't going to stop me so. She understood that. They didn't talk much during the push days, except about the work. Angle of the stones. Mixture of the mortar. Whether the flue draw was right, which he checked 3 times, because a chimney that didn't draw was a chimney that killed you with smoke. On the 7th day, when she was on her knees, fitting the final course of hearthstones, and her back was sending her very clear opinions about its current situation, he crouched down beside her without being asked, and held the last stone in place while she worked the mortar into the joint. They were so close she could hear him breathe. She was acutely uncomfortably aware of this. She did not let it make her hand unsteady. There, she said when the stone was set. He let go and sat back. They both looked at the hearth in silence. It was a good hearth. Solid, well-fitted, built to last. She'd done most of the stone selection herself, had spent 2 days in a creek bed choosing stones for density and flatness, had carried them back a load at a time in a sack on her back. Every one of them had been her decision. Her hands. "It's good work," William said, quietly. She nodded. She was too tired for words. He built the first fire in it not ceremonially, just practically because the hearth needed to cure and curing required heat, and they were both nearly frozen. The wood caught fast, and the draw was exactly right, the smoke going straight up without hesitation, and the warmth reached her face, and she closed her eyes for a moment and let it. When she opened them, William was watching the fire with an expression she'd seen before, the one that was about something older and deeper than the present moment. She recognized it. She had her own version of it. "Eleanor liked fireplaces," he said without being asked. "She said they were the most honest thing a house had. Either they work or they don't. No pretending." "She was right about that," Emily said. He looked at her. "This one works." "Yes," she said. "It does." The night before the county deadline, Emily sat in her unfinished cabin walls, up roof on hearth, working windows fitted, and did something she hadn't done in a long time. She let herself look at what she had made. She looked at it for a long time. It wasn't finished. It needed flooring, and the loft ladder wasn't right yet, and there were gaps between some of the upper wall logs she wanted to chink better before the deep cold. But it was a house. It was a real house, and it was on her land, and she had built it with her hands, and no document filed by Thomas Reed or anyone else could make it not real. She heard a horse and went to the door. William was there. He dismounted, and she saw he had a bottle in his hand, not whiskey, something clearer. He held it up a little awkward, which was not an expression she associated with him. "Figured we should mark it," he said. "Mark what?" "The hearth. He gestured at the cabin. "You built a house, Emily." She stepped back and let him in. It was the first time he'd been inside. She watched him look at it, at the walls and the rafters and the hearth. She'd spent 10 days fitting stone by stone, and his face did the thing it sometimes did, where the guard wasn't entirely up, and she saw something in it that was close to wonder. "You really built this," he said, more to himself than to her. "We built it," she said. He looked at her. The lamp caught his eyes, and she saw they were more blue than gray. She'd been wrong about that. They were definitely more blue. "No," he said. "You built it. I helped. There's a difference." She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she took the bottle from him and opened it and poured 2 cups and handed him one, and they sat on the only 2 things in the cabin that resembled chairs, a log section, and a crate, and drank something that turned out to be apple brandy, which was warm and sweet and tasted improbably like summer. "Briggs comes tomorrow," she said. "I know." "What if Reed's gotten to him?" "Briggs is a man who doesn't sleep well when he's done something he knows is wrong," William said. "I've known him long enough to know that." "That's not a guarantee." "No," he said. "But he was trying to help you the other day. When he told you what you needed to finish. He didn't have to say that." She considered this. "You're probably right." "Probably," he agreed. "I've been wrong before." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Have you? About what?" I was quiet for a moment, and the fire said things the way fires did, soft crackling things that filled the space without filling it. "About whether I could keep living the way I was living," he said. "I thought it was fine. I thought that was just what the rest of it looked like, after Eleanor." "Turns out," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Turns out it wasn't fine. It was just what running in place looks like when you've been doing it long enough that you forget you're not going anywhere." Emily held his gaze and did not look away, and did not fill the silence that followed with anything, because some silences had earned their space and deserved to keep it. "Well," she said finally, "you're going somewhere now." He nodded slow. "I think I might be." Outside the Montana, night pressed against the walls of the cabin, against her cabin. Her walls, the house she had pulled out of a frozen piece of ground, through 6 weeks of absolute refusal to stop, and held no threat that could reach her in here. Not tonight. Not in this room with its new cured hearth and its good walls, and the careful, honest presence of a man who was finding his way back to himself, one slow day at a time. The county recorder arrived at 9 in the morning. Briggs came alone without Reed, which was already a good sign. He walked through the cabin with the careful attention of a man who was taking his job seriously, and Emily walked with him, and William stood at the door and did not say a word. Briggs checked the hearth. He checked the walls. He checked the roof joists through the loft hatch and looked at the window fittings and walked the perimeter and made notes in his little book. He came back inside. He looked at Emily. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, "in my professional assessment, this structure meets, and in several respects exceeds the requirements for substantial residential completion under county code." He closed his book. "Your claim stands." She breathed. She hadn't realized until that moment how much of herself she'd been holding in, how tightly, and how long she'd been braced, and the release of it came through her, like something physical, like a rope that had been cutting into her palms, finally going slack. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs," she said. "Thank you for building a sound house," he said, and he was out the door before she could say anything else, walking fast, and looking like a man who was glad to have his part of something over with. She stood in the middle of her cabin. William was still at the door. He was looking at her. She could feel it. "It stands," she said. "It stands," he said. She laughed. It surprised her, surprised both of them, she thought, from the look on his face. She hadn't laughed in a long time, and it came out a little rough and a little helpless and not very polished, but it was real, completely real, and it filled the room and bounced off the walls she had built and came back to her changed. He didn't laugh. But the thing that wasn't quite a smile made its longest appearance yet, and she thought, watching it, that this particular expression on this particular man's face was one of the better things she'd seen in recent memory. "Don't tell me to celebrate," she said, pulling herself together. "There's still the loft ladder and the north wall chinking, and I want to get the shutters done before the next hard freeze." "I wasn't going to tell you to celebrate," he said. "Good. I was going to tell you we should start on the shutters today. Wind's going to turn north in 2 days." She looked at him. "You're probably right," she said. "Probably," he agreed. She went and got her tools. The shutters went up in a day and a half. William had been right about the wind. It turned north on the second day, exactly as he'd predicted, and the shutters held against it without a creak of complaint, which was the only review Emily needed. She ran her hand along the frame of the nearest one, checking the fit, and it was tight and clean, and she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of satisfaction before moving to the next thing on the list. The list never got shorter. That was something she'd accepted about building. You didn't finish things so much as you traded one category of unfinished for another. But the category she was in now was different from the category she'd started in. She'd started in survival. She was in something closer to living now, and the distinction mattered more than she could have explained to anyone who hadn't crossed that particular line. December settled over Montana like a verdict. The cold was serious now, not the exploratory cold of November, which still carried the memory of fall in it, but the real thing, the kind that meant business, that killed livestock and froze wells and made every decision about heat a decision about survival. Emily had laid in her firewood weeks ago, more than she thought she'd need, because William had looked at her supply one afternoon and said simply, "Double it," and she had learned by now to trust his read on the mountains. She was inside the cabin on a Tuesday morning, working on the loft ladder, fitting the rungs, checking the angles, the particular satisfaction of joinery, done right, when she heard the horse. Not William's horse. She knew William's horse by sound, now the particular rhythm of that bay's gait on the frozen ground. This was different, faster, more than one animal. She was at the door with her coat half on before the riders came into view. 3 men. She didn't recognize 2 of them, hired hands by the look, the kind of men who did other men's work and didn't ask questions about what kind. The 3rd man she recognized. Frank Cully. Thomas Reed's foreman. She'd seen him twice in town, a lean, sun-weathered man with eyes the color of creek gravel and a manner that suggested he'd long ago decided the world owed him something it hadn't yet delivered. He rode like a man who believed his horse should be grateful for the privilege. He pulled up 20 feet from her door. "Mrs. Dawson," he said. Not a greeting, just an identification. "Mr. Cully," she said. She didn't step back, didn't move her hands toward her pocket, just stood in her doorway and looked at him and waited. "Mr. Reed asked me to come by," Cully said, in the spirit of neighborly conversation. "Is that what this is?" she said. He looked at the cabin, slow, appraising the kind of look designed to make you feel observed. "You've made progress," he said. "I'll grant you that. Most folks wouldn't have gotten this far." "I'm not most folks," she said. "No." He tilted his head. "That's the issue, actually. You see, a woman in your situation alone, no family, no real resources, has a certain number of practical options. And Mr. Reed is prepared to be generous. He's authorized me to offer you fair market value for this property. Cash payment. Right now." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "The property isn't for sale." "Mrs. Dawson, the property is not for sale," she said again. Same tone, same speed, like something that had been decided a long time ago and didn't require revisiting. Cully shifted in his saddle. Something moved in his face, not anger yet, but the thing that preceded anger in men who weren't used to being told no. "You should think carefully," he said. "Montana winters are hard on a woman alone. Things happen. Accidents." The words sat in the air between them. Emily held his gaze. Her heart was moving faster than usual, but her face was not, and she'd learned that was the only thing that mattered in moments like this, that the face showed what you chose to show, and nothing else. "Was that a threat, Mr. Cully?" "It was an observation," he said, "about the nature of things." "Then I'll make an observation in return," she said. "I shot at 2 men who came onto this property in the dark 3 weeks ago. I haven't fired at anyone in the daylight yet. I'm not opposed to starting." She looked at each of the 3 men in turn. "Is there anything else?" Cully looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his horse. "Mr. Reed will be disappointed," he said over his shoulder. "Mr. Reed will survive it," she said. She stood in the doorway until they were out of sight, and then she went inside and sat down on the crate she'd been using as a chair and put her face in her hands for exactly 30 seconds. She was not crying. She was organizing herself. There was a difference, and she knew it. Then she stood up, put her coat on properly, and went to find William. How was at his ranch? She'd only been there twice, both times for practical reasons, and both times she'd been struck by the quality of the silence inside it, the way a house felt when someone had stopped expecting anything from it. She rode the horse she'd borrowed from old Pete at the general store, a reliable gray mare, who tolerated her competent but imperfect riding without complaint. She told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, which was his way, but his stillness had a different quality, this time tighter, more contained. "He sent Cully himself," William said. "Yes." "That means the indirect approaches are done." He was quiet for a moment. "He's moving to open pressure now." "That's what I thought." She looked at him. "There's a town meeting next week. The Winter Council, they do it every year, decide on road maintenance and dispute resolutions. Reed is on the council." "I know." "Is he going to bring this there?" William looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "He is." "Then I need to be there." "Yes," he said. "You do." She nodded, stood up. "Then I need to know everything you know about how those meetings work and who on that council can be reached and who can't. I need to know it before next week." He looked at her with that expression, the one she still didn't have a clean name for, and then he stood up too and said, "Sit back down. I'll get the coffee and I'll tell you everything." She sat back down. He told her everything. The names were what mattered. 6 men on the council. Reed. Martin Hale, the mill owner beholden to Reed for a loan he hadn't finished repaying. Douglas Pratt, independent, a farmer, the kind of quiet man whose opinion shifted conversations because it was rarely given. Eli Marsh. Helen Marsh's husband, who Emily had already assessed as a man who let his wife do most of his thinking for him. Carl Webb, the blacksmith, who William described with the particular economy of someone who respected the person in question. Fair man, stubborn, won't be moved by pressure, but will be moved by a good argument. And Owen Briggs, Samuel's uncle, An older man who'd been on the council since before most current residents had arrived, and who ran the meetings with a careful impartiality that had apparently survived 20 years of various pressures trying to corrupt it. "Owen Briggs is the one who matters," William said. "If he rules in your favor, it changes the room." "How do I reach him?" "You don't exactly," William said. "You make an argument that he can't ignore. Owen Briggs is not a man you persuade. He's a man you make it impossible to rule against. By having the facts. By having the facts and presenting them without drama," William said. "He has no patience for drama. He's ruled against people who were completely right because they were self-righteous about it." Emily thought about this. "And Reed's argument? That your claim has some procedural irregularity that the previous review missed. He'll have his lawyer there. He'll make it sound technical." "And my counter." William leaned forward slightly. "You have your deed. You have Briggs's assessment of completion. You have 2 years of county tax records showing the land was available for legal sale and was sold legally. And—" he paused. "I've been talking to Daniel Holt at the recorder's office. There's something else." She looked at him. "What?" 3 years ago, Reed filed a claim on a property north of here, a widow named Mrs. Garrett. Same pattern. Legal pressure, then direct pressure, then a council vote that went his way." His jaw was tight. "Mrs. Garrett lost her land. She left the county." "Is that documented?" "The council vote is. The circumstances around it are less clean. But Holt has the original claim documents, and if you look at them against what Reed is doing now, the pattern is clear." Emily sat with this. "You've been working on this for weeks," she said. "Not an accusation, just recognition." He looked at her. "Yes. You didn't tell me. I wasn't sure I had enough yet. I didn't want to raise—" He stopped, tried again. "I didn't want to tell you there was a rope to grab until I was sure it would hold." She thought about what he'd said when she'd called him on this before the apology plain and unadorned. She thought about the fact that he'd kept working on it anyway quietly without telling her. Not because he thought she couldn't handle it, but because he was trying to hand her something solid instead of something half-formed. "All right," she said. "What else do we need?" "Witnesses," he said. "People who've seen Reed's pattern. Carl Webb might speak. He's not afraid of Reed the way some are. And Pete at the general store, he's heard things over the years." "Will they?" "If you ask them directly," William said. "People are more willing than you'd think when someone looks them in the eye and asks plainly instead of hinting." She nodded, stood again this time for real. "Then I have a week's worth of work that isn't cabin building. Emily." His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He was standing now too, and there was something in the way he was looking at her, direct, careful, the way he looked at things that mattered. "You don't have to do this alone. I'll be there. I'll stand with you." She looked at him. The fire in the hearth behind him, his fireplace in his too-quiet house, sent shadows across his face, and she thought about what he'd said to her weeks ago that night in the lean-to during the first storm. "Whatever it is, I still have left to give." She thought he'd been underestimating the inventory. "I know," she said. "Thank you." She went. The week before the meeting was a different kind of work than building, but it used the same muscles, the ones built for showing up, for asking the hard question directly, for standing still when everything in you wanted to flinch. She went to Carl Webb first. Found him at his forge, a big man made bigger by his work, and she stood across the anvil from him and told him what was happening and what she needed. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then he said, "Reed's been a problem in this county for 15 years. Nobody's ever pushed back because nobody could afford to." "I can't afford not to," she said. He looked at her across the anvil. Then he nodded once, slow and final. "I'll be there," he said, "and I'll say what I saw." Pete at the general store was harder. He was a man who'd lived in Millhaven a long time and had learned the particular survival skill of being on no one's bad side, which required being on no one's good side either. He heard her out, and then he cleaned the same section of counter 3 times while he thought about it. "Reed's a customer," he said. "So am I," Emily said. "So is everyone else in this town who isn't Thomas Reed." He cleaned the counter again. "What you're really asking," he said slowly, is whether I'm willing to be seen. Yes, she said. That's what I'm asking. He stopped cleaning, looked at the counter. Then he looked at her. My wife thinks what he's doing is wrong, he said. She's told me so, 3 times. Your wife is a smart woman, Emily said. She is. He sighed. All right, I'll come. I won't lie, I'll only say what I actually heard. But I'll come. That's all I want, she said. She was walking back toward her horse when Helen Marsh appeared on the street. Emily had been half expecting this. Millhaven was small enough that her visits to the blacksmith and the general store would have been noted and discussed before she'd gotten both boots back in the stirrups. Mrs. Dawson, Helen said. Mrs. Marsh. Helen looked at her with an expression that was different from their last encounter. The certainty was still there, the judgment as default, but something had shifted underneath it. Like a house that looked the same from the outside, but had had the foundation quietly rearranged. I've heard what Thomas Reed is doing, Helen said. My husband he's been told to vote a certain way at the meeting. Emily went very still. Told by whom? Who do you think? Helen's mouth was tight. Reed had him to dinner 2 nights ago. I wasn't in the room, but I know my husband, and I know how he looked when he came back to the parlor. Mrs. Marsh, Emily said carefully. Why are you telling me this? Helen was quiet for a moment. The look on her face was the look of a woman doing something that required more from her than she usually gave, and who was aware of the cost. Because what he's doing is wrong, she said. And I've been standing on the side of what's comfortable for a long time, and I'm tired of it. Emily looked at her steadily. What will your husband do? I don't know, Helen said. He's a man who does what he's told and tells himself he's doing what he's decided. But he listens to me at the end of things. She paused. I'll talk to him. I appreciate that, Emily said. Don't thank me, Helen said. I was rude to you on the street. I said things, implied things that were unkind and unfair. This doesn't fix that. No, Emily said. But it's a start. Helen nodded once sharp and walked on. Emily stood on the street in the December cold and thought about the way things shifted. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small pivots. One person at a time, someone deciding they were tired of the position they'd been holding. She rode back to the cabin and worked on the loft ladder until dark. The night before the meeting, William came. I didn't have any particular reason, no supplies to bring, no work that needed doing. He just came and sat on the log section by the fire, and she made coffee, and they sat together in the cabin she had built and didn't talk about the meeting. They talked about other things, small things. She told him about a book she'd been reading. She'd borrowed 3 from Daniel Holt at the recorder's office, who turned out to have a decent library and a willingness to lend. And he told her about the first cattle drive he'd been on at 17, which had gone badly wrong in 3 different ways, and had nonetheless been one of the best experiences of his life. She laughed at the 3rd way it went wrong. Hy told it with the careful understatement of a man who knew the story was funny and was letting it do its own work, and she found that she was watching his face while he talked, the way it moved when he wasn't guarding it. The way humor reached his eyes a half-second after it reached his voice. The way he looked in these small, unguarded moments, like someone she was glad to know. She turned back to her coffee before that thought settled too comfortably. Are you afraid? He asked after a while. Just like that, straight and quiet. She thought about it honestly. No, she said. I'm serious. There's a difference. There is, he agreed. Are you? She asked. He looked at the fire. I'm worried about what happens if they don't listen, he said. I've seen what this town does to people it's decided aren't worth protecting. What does it do? It watches, he said. It just watches and tells itself it isn't responsible. The fire said something quiet, and she thought about that, about watching, about the months he'd spent on the ridge, observing her, and whether that was where he'd started to come back to himself. Whether seeing someone refuse to stop had reminded him that stopping was a choice, not a requirement. You stopped watching, she said. He looked at her. Yes. The night of the first storm. Yes. Why that night specifically? I was quiet for a moment. Because you were going to lose the lumber, he said. And I had the materials you needed, and I sat up on that ridge watching the storm come in, and I thought if I don't go down there, that's not me staying out of it. That's me choosing. And I was tired of what I'd been choosing. She held his gaze. Thank you for coming down. He looked at her for a long moment. In the firelight, his eyes were very blue and very direct, and she thought not for the first time that this was a man who had a great deal inside him that had nowhere to go, and was slowly, carefully finding the way out. Thank you for not shooting at me, he said. She smiled. She hadn't meant to. It arrived before she'd decided to let it, but it did, and she saw his face change when it did, in a way that made her look back at the fire fairly quickly. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow's going to need both of us sharp. He stood, put on his hat. I'll be at the meeting hall at 8. I'll be there at 7:30, she said. He almost smiled. Of course you will. He left. She sat by the fire for a long time after. The meeting hall was the largest building in Millhaven, a drafty wooden structure that served as church, courthouse, and public gathering space, depending on the day. By the time Emily arrived at 7:30, there were already a dozen people inside, and by 8, the room had filled in a way she hadn't expected. She'd thought there might be curiosity. She hadn't expected this the blacksmith and his wife Pete from the general store. 3 or 4 farmers. She recognized Daniel Holt from the recorder's office. Samuel Briggs sitting in the second row with his hands on his knees and his expression that of a man who'd made a decision he was going to stick with. Helen Marsh in the 4th row. Eli Marsh beside her looking at his hands. William came in at 7:58 and took the position beside her without ceremony, the way he took any position he'd decided on, like he'd always been planning to be there, and the only question had been the logistics. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. But she was aware of him there solid and quiet in a way that she couldn't have explained and didn't try to. Thomas Reed came in at 8:05 with his lawyer, a thin, precise man in a coat that was too good for the room, and 2 other men Emily didn't know. He saw her immediately. His expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. Owen Briggs called the meeting to order. He was exactly what William had described, an old man with a face like a hand-hewn plank flat and squared off and completely functional without a single unnecessary feature. He looked at the room over his reading glasses, and the room got quiet in a way that suggested this was reliable and well established. We'll take the routine matters first, Owen said. Road maintenance, the bridge on Miller Creek, the school supply order. Then we'll address the matter that most of you apparently came here for. The routine matters took 20 minutes. Emily sat through them and watched the room and thought about angles. She'd thought about very little else for a week. Thomas Reed's lawyer spoke for 10 minutes. He was skilled, she had to give him that. He made the title question sound like a genuine legal complexity, something any responsible county council should be concerned about. Framed entirely as civic duty and entirely divorced from any personal interest Reed might have. He used a great many words and said very little that was concrete. Owen Briggs looked at him when he finished and said, specifically, what is the legal deficiency you're claiming? The lawyer rephrased. Briggs cut him off. Specifically, Mr. Alderton. I've been on this council 22 years. I don't need the frame. Give me the picture. A ripple moved through the room. The lawyer gave him the specific claim. It was thin, a question about the original filing date and whether a 24-hour procedural window had been properly observed. Technically arguable, practically very thin. Owen turned to Emily. Mrs. Dawson, response. She stood. She had thought about how to do this with fire, with anger, with the full weight of what she'd been through. She'd decided against all of those. She told the truth the way she'd have told a building measurement, clearly, precisely, without decoration. She stated the filing date and the county's own record of receipt. She cited Samuel Briggs's completion assessment. She produced the deed and the tax records. She described, without editorializing, the 2 men who'd come onto her property in the dark, the threats Cully had delivered on her doorstep, the pattern documented in the Garrett case 3 years prior. The room was very quiet. Then Carl Webb stood up without being invited to. I'd like to say something, he said to Owen Briggs, who nodded. Carl said what he'd seen and what he'd heard over the years with Thomas Reed and land disputes in the flat, factual voice of a man who'd been a blacksmith all his life, and understood the difference between metal that was sound and metal that wasn't. He sat down. Pete stood up next. He said what he'd heard in his store. He sat down. Reed's lawyer tried to object. Owen raised one hand, and the lawyer stopped. Then Eli Marsh cleared his throat. Emily watched him. Beside him, Helen was very still. "I was asked to vote a particular way on this matter," Eli Marsh said. His voice was not strong, but it was steady. "I want the council to know that." The room changed. It was subtle the way pressure changed in a room, nothing visible, just a shift in what was possible. Thomas Reed was on his feet. "That's an outrageous—" "Mr. Reed," Owen Briggs said. One phrase the same temperature as everything else he'd said, and Reed stopped. "You'll have the opportunity to respond when Mrs. Dawson's presentation is complete. Sit down." Reed sat. Emily watched his face while he did. She saw the moment he realized the room had changed. Not one big revelation, but a sequence of small ones, like boards being pulled one at a time from a structure until the structure was no longer holding the weight it had been built to hold. She saw him recalculate. She saw him decide on something. And then she saw him look at William. Something moved between the two men. Old loaded the way. Looks moved between people with history. She didn't know what the history was. She filed it for later. Owen Briggs conducted the vote on Reed's title challenge. It failed. 4-1, Martin Hale, the only holdout. Eli Marsh voted with the majority, and he didn't look at Reed when he did it, which Emily thought was probably harder than the vote itself. It should have been over. It wasn't over. Reed stood again before Owen had finished speaking, and his voice, when he used it this time, had a different quality. The smooth civic performance was gone, and what was underneath it was harder and less managed. "I want to say something about the character of this situation," he said. "About what it means when a woman of this town—" He paused. And what came out of his mouth in the next 30 seconds was the kind of thing that men like Thomas Reed said when they'd lost the argument and had nothing left but the shape of a person to attack. He said it about her body. He said it about her judgment. He said it about what kind of woman built a house alone in the mountains, and what that said about her marriage, about what she was willing to do to get what she wanted. He said it in a public room in front of 40 people. Emily stood very still. She did not move. She did not look away from him. She let him finish. And then she looked at William. William had been very still since Reed started speaking. The controlled stillness. She recognized the kind that wasn't absence of feeling, but total management of it. He was right beside her. He could speak. She knew he wanted to speak. He didn't. The silence stretched 2 seconds, 3. And in those seconds, something happened to Emily that she hadn't expected. The hope she hadn't named, hadn't let herself name, because naming it would have made its absence unbearable. That particular hope cracked along a fault line she hadn't known was there. She turned away from William. She turned away from Reed. She looked at Owen Briggs. "I believe," she said, her voice completely even, "that the council has made its ruling. I have nothing further." She walked out of the meeting hall. She walked out into the cold December air, and she kept walking away from the building, away from the noise of the room behind her that was erupting now that she wasn't in it, and she walked until the sounds faded, and there was just the sound of her boots on the frozen ground, and the wind in the trees, and the particular terrible clarity that came after you'd been told exactly where you stood. Not by Thomas Reed. Reed was nothing. Reed was what she'd expected Reed to be. By William, who had stood beside her and said nothing. She'd thought she'd let herself think that he was someone who'd crossed the line between watching and choosing. She'd thought she'd seen it happen that night in the lean-to, in the months of work beside her in the apple brandy and the careful, honest words. But when the moment came, the real moment, the one that cost something, he'd stood still, and she'd felt the silence like cold air through a badly fitted joint. She got on her horse. She rode back to her cabin. She walked through her door. She looked at her walls, her hearth, her carefully fitted windows. She sat down, and she held the deed to her land in both hands, and she breathed. The cabin stood around her solid and square. Every log placed by her own choice and her own labor. And no one, not Reed, not the town, not any silence from any man she'd been foolish enough to hope something from, could take a single board of it. That was real. That held. She looked at the fire. She let the rest of it sit where it was going to sit. Not processed, not resolved, just present. And she made her coffee, and she looked at her walls, and she reminded herself, the way she'd been reminding herself for 8 months, that she had built something that was hers. Outside, the Montana wind came hard off the mountains and said nothing kind to anyone. Inside, the fire held. She held. But the door stayed shut, and the horse in the lean-to wasn't William's bay, and the space beside her, the space that had started quietly and without her full permission to take the shape of someone, was just space again. She'd survived worse. She would survive this. He rode back to his ranch in the dark, and the cold hit him the way it always did when he wasn't paying attention to it all at once, like something that had been waiting patiently for him to stop being numb. He unsaddled the bay and rubbed him down and fed him and did all of it mechanically, his hands knowing the work without his mind needing to be present for it, which was how he'd done most things for the past 2 years. His hands worked. The rest of him was somewhere else. Usually somewhere cold and gray, and 2 years in the past, standing by a bed in a room that smelled like fever and candle wax, talking to a woman who couldn't answer anymore. Tonight, the somewhere else was a meeting hall. Tonight, it was the specific, irreversible 3 seconds in which Thomas Reed had stood up and said those things. The ugly, small, deliberately cruel things about Emily Dawson's body, and her choices, and her worth. And William had stood beside her and felt the words land like stones and had said absolutely nothing. He went inside. Samuel Brooks was still up. The old man was always still up. He'd been William's father's ranch hand before he'd been William's, and he operated on a schedule governed entirely by his own biology and the needs of the animals, and not at all by what hour the clock said. He was at the kitchen table with a cup of something and a book he'd stopped reading, and he looked up when William came in with the particular attention of a man who'd known him long enough to read the weather of him accurately. Samuel didn't say anything right away. He let William get his coat off, let him pour himself a cup from the pot on the stove, let him sit down. Then he said, "How'd it go?" "The council ruled in her favor," William said. 4-1. "Good," Samuel said. "Reed went after her anyway, in front of the whole room." Samuel was quiet. "Said things," William said. "About her. About what kind of woman she was. Her body. Her character." He stopped. The coffee in his cup was too hot to drink, and he held it anyway. The heat of the ceramic against his palms, a small, manageable discomfort to focus on. "And I stood right there, and I didn't say a word." Samuel looked at him. "Not one word," William said. "She looked at me, and I had nothing. And then she walked out." "Why?" Samuel said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. William put the cup down. "I don't know," he said, and then immediately, "That's not true, I know. Reed and I have a history. When he stood up and started talking, I went somewhere else. I went back to the thing with his brother and the land dispute and the situation before Eleanor died, when he and I—" He stopped. I froze. Like a man who's forgotten he's not in the same fight he was in 3 years ago. "But she didn't know about the history," Samuel said. "No. So from where she was standing." "From where she was standing," William said, "I stood next to her and let a man say those things and did nothing." He looked at the table. "She walked out without looking at me. And that was the right thing to do. That was the correct response to what I did." Samuel let that sit for a moment. "You built half a cabin with that woman," Samuel said. "I know. You spent 2 months learning how she thinks and what she needs and how she moves through the world." "I know. And then when it cost you something personal, when it required you to step into a conflict that had your own name on it, you went quiet." William looked up. "Yes." Samuel folded his hands on the table. He was an old man, 70 or close to it, with hands that showed every year and eyes that showed no age at all. "You know what your father used to say about cattle that froze at a fence line? That they'd die there if you didn't move them yourself." "Yes." Samuel looked at him steadily. Some things don't wait for you to get ready, William. You go now or the moment closes, and it doesn't open again the same way. It's 10 o'clock at night. I know what time it is. I can't ride out to her cabin at 10 at night. She's alone out there and she doesn't want— I'm not talking about tonight, Samuel said. I'm talking about the thinking you're going to do tonight. That'll decide whether you go in the morning or whether you find a reason not to. I know how you reason yourself out of things. I've watched you do it for 2 years. He picked up his book, which was a signal that he'd said what he was going to say. Don't reason yourself out of this one. William sat at the table for a long time after Samuel went to bed. He did the thing Samuel had warned him about. He thought through every angle, every reason why going to Emily in the morning was a complicated thing. Why the history with Reed made his silence at least partially explainable. Why she was a capable woman who didn't need his intervention. Why the space between them had always been carefully unspoken for good reasons that still applied. He thought through all of it, and then he thought about the way she'd looked at him in the moment before she turned away. Not with anger. With something quieter and more final than anger. The specific expression of someone who had extended something fragile and felt it handed back without care. He'd seen that look before. He'd been the cause of it before. Not with Emily, with Eleanor twice early in their marriage, before he'd understood that the things you failed to say were as consequential as the things you did. Eleanor had taught him that. It had taken him too long to learn it, but he'd learned it. And then he'd spent 2 years pretending the lesson didn't apply to anything after her. He went to bed. He didn't sleep much. He was in the saddle before sunrise. The ride to Emily's cabin took 40 minutes in the dark, and he spent most of it organizing what he was going to say, which he was aware was probably the wrong approach. He was better at honesty than at organized honesty. But the alternative was arriving with nothing, and he didn't think Emily Dawson was a woman who had time for nothing. She was already up. He could see the light in the window from 50 yards out, and smoke from the chimney they'd built together, the one that drew perfectly, and he stopped his horse at the edge of the property and sat there for a moment, with the particular weight of someone about to do something they can't undo. Then he dismounted and tied the bay and walked to the door and knocked. A pause, longer than usual. "It's open," she said. He went in. She was at the small table she'd built another project she'd completed alone in the days since the meeting. He noticed, with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper she'd been writing on. She looked up at him, and her face was careful. Not hostile, not warm. Careful the way a structure was careful, built to withstand, without showing the effort. "William," she said. "I owe you an apology," he said. He didn't sit. Didn't take his hat off yet, because taking his hat off was making himself at home, and he hadn't been invited to do that. A real one. Not the kind that explains itself into something smaller. She looked at him steadily, said nothing. "What Reed said, what I let him say, I could give you reasons. I have them. But reasons aren't what matter here. What matters is that you were standing in a room full of people who'd been deciding what you were worth for 8 months, and a man said something vicious about you in front of all of them, and I was right next to you and I didn't say a word." He paused. "That was a failure. A significant one. And you deserved better." The fire in the hearth made its small sounds. The cabin was warm, her cabin, her heat, and the light was the quality it got in the early morning before the day fully committed to itself. Emily set down her pen. She looked at the paper for a moment, and then she looked at him. "Why didn't you?" she said. "And I want the real reason." He'd known she would ask this. He'd prepared for it, which meant he'd decided to tell the truth without dressing it. "Reed and I have history," he said. "Before Eleanor died, there was a property dispute. His brother and my neighbor, a man named Cal Briggs. Reed put pressure on Cal the same way he's been putting pressure on you, and I involved myself, and it went badly. Badly enough that 3 people lost things they shouldn't have lost, and one of them didn't recover from it." He stopped. "When Reed stood up in that room, I went back to that. I went back to being the man who stepped in and made things worse, and I hesitated. And hesitation in that moment was the same as absence." Emily was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that was actually working, processing, assessing, reaching a conclusion. "You were afraid of making it worse," she said. "Yes." "By speaking?" "Yes." She looked at him. "William, What he was saying was already as bad as it could get. There was no worse available. I know that now. You should have known it then. Yes, he said. I should have. She stood up, walked to the window, her window, the one she'd cut herself with a handsaw, and looked out at the gray morning for a moment. He watched her back the set of her shoulders, the particular quality of stillness she had that was never passive, always active, always thinking. I've been asking myself, she said without turning around, whether I expected too much, whether I built something in my head that wasn't there, whether I saw something in you that I wanted to see because I needed... She stopped, started again. Because I've been alone for a long time and wanting company can make you imprecise about what you're looking at. That's fair, he said. But then I think... She turned around. No, I've been precise about most things in my life. I've had to be. And what I saw in you was real. The work was real. The conversations were real. The night with the apple brandy was real. Her voice was even not with suppression, but with clarity. So the question isn't whether I was wrong about you. The question is whether that moment in the meeting hall was who you are, or whether it was what fear looks like when it gets hold of someone who should know better. The directness of it hit him, the way her directness always hit him cleanly, without confusion, leaving nowhere to hide. The second one, he said. You're sure? Yes. How do I know that, she said. Not how do you know it. How do I know it? He thought about this. Not performing the thinking, actually doing it the way she deserved. You don't, he said. Not yet. You know what I've done in the past months, and you know what I failed to do 3 days ago, and those are both real, and I can't give you a guarantee about what I'll do the next time. Something is hard, because guarantees about the future are... He stopped. What I can tell you is that I went home after the meeting, and I sat at my table, and I thought about exactly what I'd done, and exactly why, and I'm not interested in finding a version of it I can live with. I know what it was. And I'm here because I'm not willing to let it be the last thing that happened between us. Silence. She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. He'd always let her look. That was one of the things he'd understood early about Emily Dawson, that she saw things, and you didn't rush her seeing. Sit down, she said finally. He sat. He took his hat off. She poured him coffee from the pot on the hearth and set it in front of him, and then sat back down across from him. And for a few minutes, neither of them said anything, and the morning got lighter through her windows. I have a problem, she said then. Completely changed tone, practical focus the voice she used for work. He recognized the shift and followed it. Tell me, he said. Last night around midnight, someone cut 3 of my best wall logs. She watched his face. Not the cabin walls, the reserve stack. The ones I was saving to extend the cabin in spring. They didn't take them, they just damaged them. Cut them in a way that looks like a tool slip but isn't. His jaw tightened. Reed. Has to be. The county ruling went against him. It's not about the land anymore. It's about making sure I don't forget what it cost to win. Did you see anyone? No, I heard something around midnight, but by the time I got outside there was nothing. She set her cup down. I found the damage this morning. William was quiet for a moment. He's not going to stop, he said. The council ruling was a loss for him. Men like Reed, they don't accept losses. They just change the method. I know. She looked at him directly. I need to know something. The history you mentioned. Reed and his brother and Cal Briggs. What actually happened? He told her. All of it in sequence, the way he'd told her things before, without softening, without editorial. Cal Briggs had been his neighbor, a good man with a small cattle operation. Reed's brother had wanted the water rights on Cal's land, had used legal pressure, then direct pressure. William had stepped in loudly publicly, in a way that felt righteous, and was in retrospect badly timed and poorly executed. It had escalated. Cal had lost the water rights anyway, and on top of that, lost a significant portion of his herd in a dispute that got complicated by William's involvement. William had been so sure he was helping that he hadn't stopped to ask Cal what kind of help he actually wanted. Cal left the county, William said. He and his wife and their son. He shook my hand before he left, and he was a man who was too decent to say what he was thinking, which meant I had to figure it out on my own. "And you decided the lesson was don't step in," Emily said. "I decided the lesson was that I made things worse," he said. "But I applied it too broadly, like a man who burns his hand and decides fire is always the enemy." Emily looked at him. "For what it's worth," she said slowly, "the situation with me is different from Cal's. Cal didn't ask for your help. I would have." She paused. "I did. You came down off that ridge because I would have asked you to if I'd known to ask." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. "I know that. I knew it in the meeting room, and I still froze." "Yes," she said. "You did." A pause. "But you're here now." "I'm here now," he said. She looked at him for another long moment, and something shifted in her face. Not full resolution, not yet, but the first degree of it, the way ice shifted on a creek in early spring before it broke. "Then here's what I need," she said. "Reed is going to try something else. It'll be bigger than cutting logs because the meeting hall didn't stop me, and small damage won't stop me, and he knows both of those things. I need to be ready for whatever comes next, and I need—" She stopped. Then more quietly, "I need someone who won't go quiet at the moment it matters." "I won't," he said. "You can't promise that." "No," he said. "But I can tell you that what happened in that meeting hall is the thing I'm least proud of in recent memory. And I don't repeat mistakes I'm actively ashamed of. That's not a promise about the future. That's just who I am." She looked at him. She nodded once. The kind of nod that meant something was decided at least provisionally, at least enough to move forward on. "All right," she said. "Then help me figure out what Reed is going to do next." They worked it out over the next 2 hours, going through everything they knew about Reed's pattern, his resources, his remaining options. William knew more than he'd shared before, partly because some of it he'd only recently confirmed, and partly because he admitted holding some of the darker possibilities back. She made him stop when he admitted that. "All of it," she said. "From now on, all of it." "All of it," he said. The picture that emerged was not comfortable. Reed had connections with the county sheriff's office, not ownership. Nothing that clean, but the kind of relationship built on favors and social proximity that made certain conversations easier than they should be. He had the lawyer who was capable, and William had recently learned applied to purchase a parcel of land directly adjacent to Emily's property land, that if combined with hers, would give complete control of the creek access he was after. "He's not trying to take my land anymore," Emily said slowly, working through it. "He's trying to surround it, make it unlivable, push me out through pressure instead of legal means." "That's my Reed," William said. "He'd need the county assessor to approve the adjacent purchase. Owen Briggs has influence there." "Yes," William said. "And Owen Briggs already ruled against him once. But if Reed can make my claim look problematic again, not legally, but socially in terms of community standing." "He changes the context for the next decision," William finished. "Yes." She was quiet, thinking. He watched her think, the particular quality of it focused and relentless, like water finding its path through rock. "What he needs," she said, "is for people in this town to stop being willing to stand up for me. He needs the coalition that showed up at the meeting to fall apart." "Right. So whatever he does next, it'll be designed to make that cost too high for the people who came." "That's how he works," William confirmed. "Then I need to make it cost more to abandon me than to stay." She looked at him. "And I can't do that alone." The words were plainly said without drama or appeal. She wasn't asking for rescue. She was acknowledging a tactical reality. He looked at her across the table she'd built in the cabin she'd built on the land she'd fought for every inch of, and he thought about everything Samuel had said, and everything Eleanor had tried to teach him, and the specific, irreversible fact that the people who mattered most were the ones who required you to be more than what you'd managed to be so far. "I know people," he said, "more than I've been using. I've kept to myself for 2 years, and people read that as preference. It wasn't preference. It was—" He stopped. "It was cowardice dressed up as grief." She looked at him carefully. "That's hard to say." It's true, he said, and I can undo some of the damage. There are men in this county who respect me or used to, and who don't respect what Reed's been doing. I've never given them a reason to say so. I can give them that reason now. That means being visible, she said. Publicly, not just at one meeting. Yes, he said. Reed will push back on you directly. He'll use whatever he has. He can use what he has, William said. I can use what I have too. She looked at him for a moment, then quietly, What do you have? A clean record, he said. In a county where Reed's record isn't clean and people know it. 15 years of straight dealing. And the fact that I haven't asked anyone for anything in 2 years, which means when I ask now, I won't have used up whatever credit I've got. He paused. And I have you, which matters more than any of the rest of it. The sentence landed between them, and neither of them moved for a moment. He hadn't planned to say it that way. He'd meant it practically her visible character, the way she'd conducted herself, the cabin standing as evidence of her consistency. He'd meant all of that. But the words had also meant the other thing, the unspoken thing that had been living in the space between them for months, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. He didn't take it back. She looked at him for a long time. William, she said. Ma'am, he said. Old habit. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. When this is over, she said carefully. When Reed is done, and the land is unquestionably mine, and the cabin is finished, and the spring comes when there's room to think about something other than survival. She paused. I'd like to have a different kind of conversation than the ones we've been having. He held her gaze. So would I, he said. She nodded. Back to business the way she always came back to business. Then let's make sure we get there, she said. Who do you go to first, he thought. Carl Webb, he said. He already spoke at the meeting. He's not afraid of Reed. And other men watch Carl. He has the kind of standing that comes from being reliable for 20 years. Go to him today, she said. I will. He stood. And Emily. He waited until she looked up. The logs Reed damaged. What kind of cuts? Diagonal. Made to look like they'd been improperly handled. I want to look at them before I go. She led him out to the reserve stack. He crouched down beside the damaged logs and looked at them carefully, running his hand along the cuts, the way he ran his hand along everything he was trying to understand, reading it, not just seeing it. These weren't done by the men who came in the dark before, he said. Different tool, different technique. She crouched beside him. How can you tell? The angle. The men before they were intimidation pure and simple. Whoever did this knew how to handle timber. This was done by someone who understood what would make a log structurally compromised without being obviously cut. He stood. Reed has someone on his payroll who knows construction. Emily looked at the logs and then at him. Then he knows what will hurt the most. Yes, William said. Which means we need to move faster than we thought. She straightened up. How fast? Before he does something we can't recover from, he said. I'll see Carl today. Tonight I'll go to Douglas Pratt. He's been quiet, but he's been watching, and quiet men who watch are often waiting for someone to give them a reason to act. And Reed? William looked at her. Let me worry about Reed. I'll worry about Reed, she said immediately. You can also worry about Reed. Worry isn't a limited resource. He almost smiled. Fair, he said. He stepped back toward his horse. I'll come back tonight with whatever I've got. I'll be here, she said. He mounted. Looked down at her standing in the cold morning beside her stack of damaged logs, her coat pulled around her, and her chin at the angle it always went when she was resolved about something. Emily, he said. She looked up. I'm sorry about the meeting, he said. Once more, and then I won't say it again because saying it more than once starts to be about me instead of about you. She looked at him for a moment. Go see Carl Webb, she said. He went. Carl Webb heard him out in the same way he always heard things completely without interruption, with the focused attention of a man who respected the value of information. When William finished, Carl put down the piece of iron he'd been holding and wiped his hands and said, I've been waiting for someone to organize this. I'm not sure it's organized yet, William said. It's more organized than it was yesterday, Carl said. Who else? Pratt tonight. I'm thinking Henry Alcott and the Garfield brothers if Pratt's in. Carl nodded. Alcott's been angry about Reed's water access situation since last spring. He'll come in. He looked at William steadily. What's your endgame here? Because if Reed's going to push harder, we need to be ready to push harder back. What does that look like? It looks like Reed losing the adjacent property purchase, William said. And losing it publicly with enough of the county watching that another attempt costs more than it's worth. And the woman, Carl said. Not unkindly, just directly. Her claim is solid, William said. She built a sound house on legal land. She shouldn't have to keep defending that. No, Carl said. She shouldn't. He picked up his iron again. Come back at 6. I'll have 2 more with me. William came back at 6. Carl had 3, not 2 Henry Alcott and the Garfield brothers as predicted, plus Samuel Holt. Daniel's father, an older man who'd been a territorial ranger before settling in Millhaven, and who had. Carl said with a dry precision a number of opinions about the way Thomas Reed did business that he'd been keeping to himself for some time. They sat around Carl's work table, and William laid out everything. The pattern of the Garrett case, the meeting hall incident, the damaged logs, the adjacent property application, the connections with the sheriff's office. He laid it out the way. Emily had laid out her case to Owen Briggs, clearly without drama, letting the facts do what they did when they weren't buried under performance. Samuel Holt listened to all of it and then said, "The sheriff's connection, do you have anything concrete?" "Not yet," William said. "I have the shape of it." "Get something concrete," Holt said. "I can help with that. I still know people in the territorial office." He looked around the table. The rest of this, the adjacent property application that's got a 10-day review period. If we can get Owen Briggs to flag it for extended review, it buys us time. Owen Briggs already ruled against Reed once, Alcott said. He'll want something solid before he goes at him again. We give him something solid, William said. The Garrett file, the original documents from Daniel Holt at the recorder's office. We put that in front of Owen formally, not as a meeting argument, but as a written record. There was a short silence around the table. That requires someone to file it, Carl said. Formally, with their name on it. I'll file it, William said. My name. The men at the table looked at each other. Reed's going to come after you, Henry Alcott said. He'll try, William said. Let him. Something shifted at that table, the same thing that had shifted in the meeting hall when Eli Marsh cleared his throat. Except this time, it was 5 men, and the shift was deliberate, chosen the way you chose to put weight on a beam you'd decided to trust. He rode back to Emily's cabin after midnight. The light was still on. Of course it was. She came to the door when she heard him and stood in the frame with the light behind her, and he told her what had happened. Carl Holt, all of it, and she listened in the way she listened to everything, completely filing it where it went. Samuel Holt, she said when he finished. The territorial ranger. Former, William said. Still. Something moved in her expression, the first genuinely lighter thing he'd seen on her face in days. That's significant, William. It's a start, he said. But Reed moves fast. Whatever he's planning. He'll do it soon, she said. I know. She looked at him. Thank you, for today. He nodded, started to turn back to his horse. William. He turned back. She was looking at him from the doorway she'd built of the house she'd built on her own land, and her face had the quality it got when she was about to say something she'd decided to say and was going to say it straight. Whatever kind of man you were when you were frozen by that old fear, she said, I don't think that's who you actually are. I think that's who you had been for long enough that you forgot it wasn't permanent. She paused. I think the man who came down off that ridge the night of the first storm is closer to the truth of you. He looked at her. I wanted you to know I think that, she said. Not as a promise about the future, just as what I observe. He stood in the cold dark outside her door and felt something move in him that had been still for 2 years. Not dramatically, not like a flood, but the way water moved under ice when the temperature turned slow, certain and entirely unstoppable. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to be a hard day. It is, she agreed. I'll be here at first light. I know, she said. And she went back inside and closed the door, and the light in the window was warm and steady, and his in the only way things could be his, not by ownership, but by the fact that he had chosen to stand close to it. He rode home in the dark. He slept. For the first time in 2 years, he slept without difficulty, because a man who knows what he's going to do in the morning has less use for the company of old regrets. The morning was going to require all of him. He intended to be there for it. He was at the cabin before sunrise as he'd said he would be. Emily had the coffee on. She'd been up since 4, which he could tell by the way she moved. Not tired exactly, but the particular quality of someone who'd already done a great deal of thinking before the day officially started. She handed him a cup without ceremony, and they sat at the table she'd built and went over the plan the way they'd gone over building plans methodically, checking each joint for weakness, identifying what would hold and what might not. The morning felt different. Something had settled between them the night before, not resolved, not finished, but stabilized, the way a structure stabilized once the key piece was properly seated. They were both aware of it, and neither of them mentioned it, which was its own kind of fluency. Samuel Holt is meeting with his contact in the territorial office today, William said. If there's anything concrete on the sheriff's connection to Reed, we'll have it by nightfall. And Owen Briggs. Carl is hand-delivering the Garrett file this morning, with my name on the cover letter. Emily looked at him. Reed will know by noon. Yes. He'll move fast. That's what I'm counting on, William said. A man who moves fast in anger makes different decisions than a man who moves carefully. She studied him. You want him to react. I want him to overreach, William said. There's a difference. Reed's been careful for years, careful enough that people could look past what he was doing if they wanted to. If he moves out of anger, he stops being careful, and then it's not a matter of what people want to see. It's a matter of what's right in front of their faces. Emily was quiet for a moment, turning it over. That's a risk, she said. If he overreaches in the wrong direction toward the property directly toward people who can't defend themselves. I know, William said. That's why I'm going to be visible today, in town, where he can see me. If his anger is going somewhere, I want it going at me. She put down her cup. No, she said. Emily, I said no. Her voice was even not raised, but completely firm. I am not sitting in this cabin while you draw fire on yourself. That is not the arrangement. He looked at her. The arrangement is keeping you safe. The arrangement, she said, is that we do this together. That was what we said. Together means I'm not hidden away while you take the risk. She met his eyes directly. I will not be the reason something happens to you, William. I will not carry that. The word carried hit him somewhere specific. He understood it, the weight of being the reason, the particular guilt of someone who'd let another person step in front of something meant for them. She understood that weight because she'd watched James step into a mine shaft to earn money for their life together, and the weight of that had been on her since March. He wasn't going to add to it. All right, he said. Together. She nodded once. I need an hour to finish the loft ladder, then we go to town. An hour, he said. She went to work. He sat with his coffee and watched her work and thought about the 10 months since Eleanor had died that he'd spent trying to convince himself that a life lived entirely inside its own borders was acceptable. He thought about the ridge. He thought about the first morning he'd come down off it and she'd pulled a gun on him in the snow, and he'd thought even then, even in that first moment, this is someone who does not intend to be destroyed. He'd been right about that. He'd been right about very little else in recent years, but he'd been right about that. The hour passed. The loft ladder was done. He checked it without being asked, giving it his weight on each rung, and it held solidly, the joints clean and tight. She watched him test it with her arms folded and an expression that said she knew it would hold, and was letting him check anyway, out of respect for thoroughness. Good work, he said. I know, she said. Let's go. They rode into Millhaven together side by side, which was not something they'd done before. The practical reason had always been that they traveled from different starting points, him from the ranch, her from the cabin or the boarding house. The real reason both of them knew was that arriving together meant being seen together, and being seen together meant the town would draw conclusions that neither of them had been ready to confirm. They were ready now. The town noticed immediately. This was Millhaven, so of course it noticed. She saw the looks from the moment they rode down the main street, the turned heads, the interrupted conversations, the particular alertness of a small community registering a new data point. She kept her chin level and her eyes forward and let them look. William touched the brim of his hat to Helen Marsh, who was on the sidewalk outside the dry goods store, and who looked at them both with an expression that was complex, surprised, calculating, and somewhere underneath all of that, something that might have been relief. They tied their horses in front of Carl Webb's shop. Carl came out before they'd finished tying. He looked at Emily, and then at William, and he said, "Owen Briggs has the file. I watched him read the first page." "How did he react?" William asked. "He read slower," Carl said. "For Owen, that's a significant reaction." Emily almost smiled. "And Reed hasn't been seen yet this morning. His lawyer was at the land office first thing I heard that from Pete. Don't know what he was doing there." William and Emily looked at each other. "The adjacent property application," Emily said. "He's trying to accelerate it," William said, "before Owen can flag it for review." He turned back to Carl. "I need you to go to Owen right now. Tell him to put a hold on any property applications filed in the last 72 hours, pending the full Garrett file review." "Can he do that?" Emily asked. "He's the council chair," Carl said. "He can do a lot of things when he decides something warrants it." He was already moving. "I'll be back in 20 minutes. I went at a pace that was almost a run. William turned to Emily. "Stay close," he said. "Always intended to," she said. They went to Pete's store because they needed supplies, and because Pete's store was the center of Millhaven's information network, and they needed to be in that center. Pete looked up when they walked in, and something moved in his face, not quite worry, not quite relief, something between them. "Reed was here this morning," Pete said without being asked. He said it quietly, like a man who'd decided to be useful and was committing to it. "An hour ago. He was asking about you." He looked at Emily. "About whether you'd been in recently, who you'd been talking to." "What did you tell him?" Emily said. "The truth," Pete said. "That you were a regular customer, and that I had no particular knowledge of your personal arrangements." He paused. "He didn't like that." "No," William said. "He wouldn't. He said," Pete hesitated. "He said that people who associated too closely with certain problems in this county sometimes found that their own business arrangements became complicated." The sentence sat on the counter between them. "That's a threat, Pete," Emily said. "Yes, ma'am," Pete said. "It is." "Are you going to let it move you?" Pete looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at William. Then he looked back at Emily. My wife told me this morning that she was proud of what I said at the meeting," he said. "First time in a long time she said something like that to me. So." He squared his shoulders in the small way of a man who'd made a decision he was going to stick with regardless of the cost. "No, I'm not going to let it move me." Emily put her money on the counter. "Then I'll take my usual order," she said. "And thank you, Pete." They were back outside when they heard the horse. Thomas Reed came down the main street of Millhaven the way he always did, like a man who owned the road he was on, which in his mind he probably did, since he owned so much else. He was alone, which was unusual. No Cully, no hired hands. Just Reed and the expression of a man who'd spent the morning recalculating and had arrived at a number he didn't like. He pulled up when he saw them. William stepped forward slightly. Not in front of Emily beside her, the way he'd been all morning, the way he should have been in the meeting hall. "Carter," Reed said. The pleasantness was completely gone. This was the real voice, the one underneath the civic manner. "I see you've decided to make this personal." "It's been personal for months," William said. "You made it that way when you sent men onto her property at midnight." Reed's eyes moved to Emily. "Mrs. Dawson, I've made you a fair offer for that land. Multiple times. I'd encourage you to reconsider." "I've considered it as many times as I intend to," Emily said. "The answer is the same as it's always been." Things have a way of changing, Reed said. Meaning what? William said. Reed looked at him. Something moved in his face, old and specific, and loaded with the history between them. Meaning that the county has a long memory, Carter. And some of that memory involves you. Choices you made. People who suffered because of those choices. The air went very still. Emily felt William go rigid beside her. She felt it without looking at him, the specific quality of someone whose oldest wound had just been pressed. She spoke before he could. "Mr. Reed," she said, and her voice was clear and completely without anger, which was its own kind of power. "I know about the Garrett case. I know about Cal Briggs. I know the full pattern of how you operate, and I know that you've built your position in this county on the willingness of other people to stay quiet." She looked at him directly. "We have filed the Garrett documents with Owen Briggs. We have a former territorial ranger reviewing your connection to the sheriff's office. We have 6 men in this county who have agreed to stand publicly on the record about your methods." She paused. "You can use William's history against him if you want. But his history is already in the open. He's already named it. You can't damage a man with something he's already claimed." Reed stared at her. The street was quiet. She had been aware for the last 30 seconds that they were not alone. People had stopped. Pete was in his doorway. Helen Marsh was across the street. 2 farmers she recognized from the meeting. A woman she didn't know holding a child's hand and watching with the particular attention of someone who understood that something significant was happening. "You have nothing," Reed said. But his voice had changed. The certainty had a crack in it. "We have everything," Emily said. "And you know it. You've known it since Carl Webb stood up at the meeting. You've been trying to move fast enough to get ahead of it, but you can't move fast enough. Because every person you've threatened has decided the threat costs less than the alternative." She took 1 step toward him, not aggressive, not retreating, just closing the distance precisely enough to make the point. "I built my cabin 1 log at a time, Mr. Reed. And I beat your legal challenge 1 vote at a time. And I am going to protect my land 1 person at a time until there is no one left in this county willing to do your work for you. That is not a threat. That is a description of what is already happening." The silence stretched. Reed looked at her. He looked at William. He looked at the street, at Pete in his doorway, at Helen Marsh across the way, at the growing cluster of people who had stopped to watch and were not notably looking away. He turned his horse. He rode back the way he'd come. Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter than that, and realer, the particular feeling of something large, shifting on its foundations, not spectacularly, but completely the way. A river changed course in spring gradually, and then all at once, and then permanently. William exhaled beside her. She heard it. "You all right?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Then, what you said about my history." "I meant it," she said. "A wound that's been named isn't a weapon." He looked at her. "Where did you learn that?" She thought about it. "James," she said. "He used to say the things you're ashamed of only have power in the dark. Once you've said them out loud, they're just facts. And facts can be dealt with." She paused. "He was a smart man. He just didn't always apply his own wisdom." "Neither did I," William said. "Neither do most people," she said. "That doesn't make the wisdom wrong." Carl Webb appeared at the end of the street, moving fast with the expression of a man carrying information. "Owen Briggs put the hold on," he said when he reached them, slightly out of breath. "All pending applications. He's calling a formal review." He looked at Emily. "And he wants to meet with you, tomorrow morning. Bring your deed and anything else you've got." She nodded. "I'll be there." Carl looked between them. A small smile crossed his face and left quickly, like it had somewhere else to be. "Thought you might," he said, and went back toward his shop. They rode back to the cabin in the afternoon light. It was the kind of winter afternoon Montana occasionally produced as a concession. Cold, still always cold, but with a quality of light that was almost generous, that made the mountains look like something someone had painted, rather than something that was simply and indifferently there. She didn't say this because she wasn't in the habit of talking about the way things looked, but she was aware of it. She was aware of a great many things riding back. She was aware of William beside her, the rhythm of his horse matching hers in the easy way it did now after months of working the same piece of ground together. She was aware of the deed in her coat pocket she'd taken to carrying it these last weeks the way you carried something you needed to know was real. She was aware that the cabin they were riding toward was hers completely, and unarguably hers, and that whatever Owen Briggs's meeting produced tomorrow, Reed had made his last move today and known it. She could feel it. The shape of a thing ending. They unsaddled the horses in silence, the comfortable kind, and she was feeding the gray mare when William said from the other side of the lean-to, "Samuel Holt sent word while we were in town." She looked around the partition, and the sheriff's deputy, not the sheriff himself, a deputy named Cole, has been on Reed's payroll for at least 2 years. Holt has the records. He looked at her. Territorial law will want to move on that independent of anything Owen Briggs decides. She absorbed this. Reed is going to be very busy defending himself in the next few months. He is, William said. He won't have much attention left over for you. No, she said. He won't. She turned back to the mare, finished her work, and when she came around the partition, William was standing in the middle of the space they'd reinforced together the night of the first blizzard, looking at the lean-to walls with an expression she recognized, the one where he was seeing something that was also something else, layered time. "This is where it started," he said. Not to her exactly, just aloud. "The lean-to," she said. "You were going to ride it out alone," he said. "You had a spirit lamp and half a tin of hardtack, and you were going to be fine." "I was going to be fine," she confirmed. "I know." He turned to look at her. "That's the thing I keep thinking about. You were going to be fine no matter what. The cabin would have gotten built. You would have fought Reed. You would have won probably, or found a way to keep fighting. You didn't need me." She looked at him steadily. "That's true," she said. "So why?" He stopped. "I'm trying to understand what I actually contributed. Whether I—" "William," she said. He stopped. She looked at him with the plain, direct look she gave everything that deserved her full attention. "You know what the hardest part of this year was? Not Reed, not the cold, not the work." She paused. "It was doing all of it without anyone knowing my name, without anyone knowing that I was there, that I was trying. You can do hard things alone. People do hard things alone all the time. But there is something—" She searched for the word. "There is something that changes when someone sees you, witnesses you, not to rescue you, not to take over, just to know that you're real and that what you're doing is real." She looked at him. "You came down off that ridge, and you knew my name, and you worked beside me, and you saw the cabin go up one log at a time, and you knew what it cost. That's not a small thing. That's not nothing." I was quiet for a long moment. "Eleanor used to say I was bad at letting things matter to me," he said. "She said I held everything at a slight distance, like I was afraid that if I let something get too close it would—" He stopped. She said it with more kindness than it deserved. "She sounds like she was very kind," Emily said. "She was," he said. "And right. About most things." He looked at Emily. "She'd have liked you." Emily considered this. "I think I'd have liked her. She would have argued with you about something within the first 10 minutes, he said. "She argued with everyone she respected." "Then I look forward to it," Emily said. He smiled. A real one, not the almost smile she'd been cataloging for months. The full thing unhurried, and it changed his face so completely that she understood for the first time why people who'd known him before Eleanor's death talked about him the way you talked about a place you used to love, with nostalgia for something that had been and the complicated feeling of seeing it again. She felt the heat come to her face and looked at the lean-to wall. "I want to ask you something," William said. "Ask. When spring comes, when the ground thaws, and there's room to think about what isn't survival." He paused. "I'd like to expand the cabin. You mentioned a second room, a proper kitchen. I know you have your own ideas about how it should go, and I'm not offering to take that over." He was choosing his words carefully, she could hear it. "I'm asking if I can be part of it. Not as a hired hand. As someone who's here because he wants to be here. Because you are the most extraordinary person I've encountered in my life, and I've spent too much of this year being careful about saying so." The lean-to was very quiet. She turned around and looked at him properly, without the careful sideways assessment she'd been using for months. The way you looked at something you weren't quite ready to see straight on. She looked at him straight on now. How was a man who had been broken and had carried the breaking well without drama and without healing until something had required him to put the pieces back into a different shape. He was a man who knew how to work beside someone without erasing them. He was a man who had come down off a ridge in a blizzard because he'd gotten tired of what he'd been choosing, and that particular moment of getting tired and then acting was the most honest thing she'd seen from another person in as long as she could remember. "The kitchen will need a specific kind of foundation," she said, "given the soil on the east side." Something moved in his eyes. "I know that soil," he said. "I'll bring extra gravel from the creek." "And I want windows on 2 walls," she said, "for the light." "2 walls," he agreed. "Done." She looked at him. "Then yes," she said. "I'd like that. I'd like you to be part of it." I took one step toward her and stopped, careful asking the distance, rather than deciding it, and she closed the remaining space because she'd never in her life waited for someone else to decide what she wanted, and she wasn't going to start now. I was warm and solid and unhurried, and the hand he put at the side of her face was a working man's hand, rough and certain. And she thought briefly, clearly, without sentimentality, that she had built a house on frozen ground by herself and survived a year that should have ended her, and she had earned the right to want this and take it without apology. She took it. When they stepped apart, the light outside had shifted. Longer shadows, the afternoon going toward evening, the particular gold light that came just before dark in December, and lasted about 15 minutes and was worth every cold minute of the month. "Owen Briggs tomorrow," she said. "Owen Briggs tomorrow," he confirmed. "And the kitchen in spring." "None." "And the kitchen in spring," he said. His voice was quieter than usual, and steadier than usual, and had the quality of a man whose compass had found north after a long time spinning. She nodded once. "Then let's go inside," she said. "I'll make dinner." "I'll make dinner," he said. "You've been feeding me for months." She raised an eyebrow. "Can you cook?" "Eleanor tried to teach me," he said. "That answers nothing." "No," he admitted. "It doesn't." She laughed. He held the door of her cabin open for her, and she walked through it into her house, her walls, her light, her fire. And it was the most natural thing in the world, and it was enormous, and both of those things were true at the same time. The meeting with Owen Briggs lasted 2 hours. How was exactly what William had said. A man who did not need performance, who wanted facts laid flat, and would sort through them himself without assistance. Emily gave him every document she had, and answered every question he asked with the same precision she'd used on the foundation logs. He listened without comment until the end, and then he closed the folder and looked at her over his reading glasses. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, "this claim is sound. It was sound before, and it's sound now." He paused. "I regret that the council process has been used in a way that caused you to have to defend it repeatedly." "I appreciate that," she said. "The adjacent property application," he said, "will not be approved. I'll be recommending a broader review of Mr. Reed's land dealings to the territorial authority. That's somewhat beyond my usual scope, but the Garrett case..." He stopped. "The Garrett case is not something I was aware of in its full detail. It should have come to my attention. It didn't, and that's a failure of this office." He said it plainly, the way a man of genuine integrity said the hard things without drama, without excessive self-flagellation. Just as a fact that needed naming. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs," she said. "Don't thank me." He said exactly as Helen Marsh had said it. Emily thought there was something in the water in Millhaven that made people say that when they were trying to do right after doing wrong. "Just come to me directly if there's further trouble. You shouldn't have had to build a coalition to get a fair hearing." She left the meeting hall, and William was outside waiting on the step, and he looked at her face and said, "Good, over," she said. He exhaled. One long, quiet breath, and she thought that breath probably contained a lot: the months of work, the damaged logs, the silent moment in the meeting hall, and everything. It had cost both of them the miles between his ridge and her piece of frozen ground, and all the distance he'd traveled to close them. "Over," he said. The spring came to Montana, the way it always did, arguing with winter for 6 weeks, and then winning suddenly and completely like a verdict that surprised no one, but still had to be formally delivered. The creek ran fast, and the mud was deep, and the world smelled like everything thawing at once, which was not entirely pleasant, but was entirely alive. They broke ground on the kitchen in the first week of April. He'd brought the gravel from the creek as promised. She'd drawn the plans herself, 2 windows on east and south foundation specs for the soil proportions that matched the existing cabin without copying it. He looked at the plans for a long time, and then said they were good, which she'd known, and suggested one modification to the door swing that she considered and adopted because it was right. Carl Webb came the first Saturday and brought his 2 oldest sons. The Garfield brothers came the second. Henry Alcott showed up one afternoon with a load of timber. He said he had extra, of which she suspected wasn't entirely true, but accepted without argument. Samuel Holt came once, spent a day fitting stones for the new exterior hearth, and left without being asked to stay for supper, though he accepted coffee. Helen Marsh brought food 3 times. She never asked to come in, and Emily never invited her in, and somehow this was correct for where they were, which was a long way from where they'd been, and not yet where they might get to. And all 3 of those things were true simultaneously. Pete sent flour and sugar with William one morning, with a note that said simply, "For the house." She folded the note and kept it. The cabin grew. It grew the way the first part of it had grown through work and decision, and the specific satisfaction of a problem solved with your own hands. But it was different now, because she wasn't alone inside it anymore. Not that someone was always there. But the presence was there even in the absence, the way a fire warmed a room, even after it had settled to coals. She thought about James sometimes in those spring weeks. Thought about what he would have made of all of it. The cabin, the fight with Reed, the man who came every day and worked beside her without trying to take over the work. She thought James would have liked William in the way that decent men recognized each other. She thought James would have been glad. She let herself think that, and it didn't hurt the way it used to. It was just true. On the day the kitchen was finished, the last board set, the last nail driven, the stove she'd ordered from the catalog finally installed, and drawing perfectly. William stood in the middle of the new room and turned around once slowly, the way he'd looked at the first cabin the night of the apple brandy. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He looked at her. "It's good work." "It is," she agreed. He reached into his coat pocket and produced something small, wrapped in a piece of cloth. He held it out to her, and she took it and unwrapped it and found a key. Plain iron, cleanly made, the kind Carl Webb made without ornamentation and with absolute reliability. She looked at it. "For the door," he said. "I asked Carl to make a proper lock for the front door. You've had that old bar latch since November, and it's not—" "William," she said. He stopped. She looked at the key for a moment longer. Then she looked at him. "Ask me directly," she said. "Whatever you mean by this, ask me directly." He was quiet for exactly 1 breath. "I'd like to come home to this house," he said. "I'd like it to be a place I come home to, and not just a place I help build. I'd like—" He paused. "I'm not asking you to give up anything that's yours. Everything here is yours. Everything you built is yours, and it always will be. I'm asking if there's room in it for me, not as a neighbor, as something that means more than that." She held the key. She thought about the ridge and the first blizzard and the hearth that drew perfectly and the meeting hall and the terrible silence and the morning he'd come back and said, "I'm not willing to let it be the last thing between us." She thought about Carl and Pete and Samuel Holt and Helen Marsh with her food and the Garfield brothers and the whole slow, improbable turning of a town that had made its mind up about her, and then one person at a time changed it. She thought about the deed in her coat pocket and the feeling of Owen Briggs saying it was over, and the spring air and the kitchen they'd just finished, and all the mornings ahead in which there would be coffee and work, and the particular reliability of someone who had learned at cost the difference between watching and choosing. She closed her hand around the key. "Yes," she said. "There's room." He crossed the kitchen floor in 2 steps, and she didn't move back. And the third time they were this close, it was entirely natural and entirely right, and outside the Montana spring was arguing with the last of the cold and winning, and the creek ran over its banks a little, the way it did every year, generous and indifferent and alive. The cabin stood, not because it had been built perfectly. It hadn't been. There were gaps she'd rechinking every season, and a rafter she'd been watching with mild concern since February. Not because nothing had tried to bring it down, a great deal had tried, and some of it had come close. It stood because she had built it to stand one decision at a time, one chosen log at a time, through cold and doubt, and the specific cruelty of people who'd looked at her and seen only what she was not. She had looked back at them and shown them what she was. The cabin stood because Emily Dawson had refused absolutely and without exception to be the kind of woman who stopped, and William Carter, who had come down off his ridge because he'd gotten tired of what he'd been choosing, and who had learned slowly and at real cost to choose differently, stood beside her in the kitchen they'd built together and held the hand of the woman who had taught him that second chances were not given by fate or luck, but built deliberately by people brave enough to pick up the tools again. They were not a perfect story. They were a true one. And in Montana, in the spring of 1888, with the creek running high and the mud deep and the mountains indifferent and eternal in every direction. A true story was the only kind worth telling, and the only kind that lasted, and the only kind that was ever in the end enough.